It was one of the most expensive engineering projects ever. A double-decker bridge over 8 miles long, with 10 lanes of traffic connecting two bustling cities in California's Bay Area. Then, a devastating earthquake, and a reconstruction project of more than 10 years and $6.5 billion in the making. How did California replace its longest bridge span, one that 280,000 people drive on every single day, without bringing an entire city to a standstill? The story of Bay Bridge has it all. Emperors, earthquakes, the US Navy, SEALs, the FBI, and even Arnold Schwarzenegger. But the way the bridge was removed and replaced, that's even more unbelievable. So stick around. It's a story you'll definitely want to hear. Now, when people think of San Francisco bridges, the iconic Golden Gate Bridge is the one that usually comes to mind. But there's another bridge in town, the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge, better known as the Bay Bridge. Stretching 8 miles, this double-decked giant connects San Francisco to Oakland, and it's a crucial part of Interstate 80. It's one of the widest bridges in the world, with 10 lanes to prove it. But despite all that, it still lives in the shadow of its more famous sibling. But we're about to give it the spotlight it deserves. The dream of a bridge connecting San Francisco with Oakland, Berkeley, and Alameda began as early as 1850, when newspaper editor William Walker proposed a causeway similar to the 1,800-foot Clay Street Wharf. Fast forward to the Gold Rush days, and the idea of a bridge connecting the areas gained traction due to San Francisco's worries about its trade future after the Transcontinental Railroad connected Oakland to the rest of the country in 1869. By 1872, the whimsical Emperor Joshua Norton, a San Francisco resident who had earlier declared himself Emperor of the United States, decreed that a bridge be built. He famously stated, "We do hereby command the arrest by the army of both the boards of city fathers if they persist in neglecting our decrees." What he lacked in actual civic power, he made up for in vision. However, it wasn't until the 1920s, with the rise of automobiles, that the Bay Bridge project finally gained momentum. In 1929, the California legislature got serious about making it happen and created the California Toll Bridge Authority, which took action on earlier bridge proposals. Construction kicked off in July of 1933, and in just 3 years and 5 months, the bridge was completed. It opened in November of 1936, just 6 months before its more famous neighbor, the Golden Gate Bridge. On opening day, former President Herbert Hoover issued the bold proclamation, "This is the greatest bridge yet constructed in the world." The total cost of the 3-year project? A staggering $77 million. Wait, $77 million in 3 years? What happened to the 10-year, $6.5 billion figures we mentioned at the beginning of this video? Well, there's a simple explanation. The bridge isn't the same one that opened in 1936. And an earthquake is responsible for that. On October 17, 1989, at exactly 5:04 p.m., the Loma Prieta earthquake struck with a vengeance, rattling the Bay Area with a magnitude of 6.9. It killed 63 people and injured over 3,700. Over 80 bridges were affected, including the Bay Bridge. A 76 by 50 foot or 23 by 15 meter section of the bridge's upper deck on the eastern side snapped and fell onto the deck below. It claimed one of the 63 total lives lost during the earthquake. Just imagine, a staggering 50-foot chunk of the Bay Bridge's upper deck collapsed as 2 million pounds of thrust caused the frame to shift 7 inches, shearing off bolts that connected the deck to the supports. It was a stark reminder just how vulnerable this aging giant had become. But this was nothing new to the officials of the California Department of Transportation, or Caltrans, which had been raising alarms about the bridge's crack-susceptible eye-bar design for years. The earthquake turned those whispers into a deafening roar. The Loma Prieta earthquake underscored a critical truth. The Bay Area's bridges had to be rebuilt to withstand earthquakes that could strike at any moment. With a 70% probability of a major quake happening in the next 30 years, the stakes were high. If a 6.9 magnitude earthquake could do that much damage, what would happen if one the magnitude of the San Francisco quake of 1906, which hit 7.8 on the Richter scale, struck? Given that the Bay Bridge had historically struggled with seismic threats, it undeniably became a ticking time bomb. So, Caltrans sprang into action. The agency had a straightforward mission: to replace the eastern span with a new bridge that met modern seismic and safety standards. The Caltrans officials needed something that could sustain an 8.5 magnitude quake, and they were determined to make it happen. But you can't just close a bridge that carries over 250,000 commuters every single day between Oakland and San Francisco. That's a logistical nightmare waiting to happen. So they came up with an audacious plan: build a new bridge and destroy the old one, all the while keeping the traffic flowing. It was a plan that called for precise statistical planning. First, the corridor schedule team was born, tasked with monitoring the progress of a whopping 21 contracts. Managing a project of this scale required serious coordination. Every contract had to be analyzed for potential risks. If one aspect was accelerated, would it affect another? What were the costs? The effects on schedules? The team had its work cut out for them. But they managed to keep the traffic flowing. To accomplish this massive undertaking, two innovative detours were introduced: the Yerba Buena Island Detour and the Oakland Touchdown Detour. The Yerba Buena Island Detour played a critical role. It rerouted traffic off the old roadway, allowing construction crews to demolish the aging spans and build new transition structures right on the island as they installed the new self-anchored suspension, or SAS, spans. Thanks to this strategic maneuver, Caltrans not only kept the project moving, but even stayed ahead of schedule, a rare feat in massive infrastructure projects. It was a masterclass in logistics, but there was still a monumental task ahead. After all, we're talking about the largest bridge project in California's history and one of the preeminent engineering feats of the 20th century. For this project, every step had to be meticulously planned and executed to successfully transform a vital transportation artery while keeping the Bay Area moving. It was a feat that demanded not just ingenuity, but also precise coordination. At its tallest point, the bridge stood 135 feet above water, tapering down to 40 feet as it reached the shore. Each span needed to be angled just right as it approached the land, all while factoring in the unpredictable tidal changes and weather conditions of the bay. Plus, time was a major factor. Every bridge segment had to be removed between November and April to avoid interfering with migratory birds returning to nest. This only added to the sense of urgency. But perhaps the most formidable challenge lay in the engineering of the central anchorage, which required sinking 265 feet or 80 meters below the water to reach solid bedrock. This monumental task used a multiple dome caisson, a brilliant invention that showcased the innovative spirit driving this project. And if you thought accessing the necessary construction sites was straightforward, think again. Caltrans faced a year-long struggle to get permission from the Navy to even conduct geological testing on Yerba Buena Island, leading to significant delays and rising costs. But these costs were nothing new. Initially, the plan was to retrofit the existing eastern span, estimated to cost approximately $200 million. However, further engineering assessments revealed that building a new bridge would cost a few $100 million more, but yield a much longer lifespan, 75 to 100 years versus a mere 30 years for the retrofit. But that wasn't the end of the road. The aesthetics of the initial design, often criticized as a freeway on stilts, sparked significant pushback from the public and local politicians. To address these concerns, a dedicated design team set out to choose a signature span that would be both functional and visually iconic. Yet the process was anything but smooth. Conflicts arose within the engineering and design advisory panel, especially as panel members faced the challenge of evaluating proposals from their own firms. And of course, the problems would only continue to pile up once the construction of the new bridge actually started. But each time, the team found a way to adapt and innovate. The construction of the new SAS bridge kicked off with the Skyway section in 2002. This impressive stretch spanned 1.2 miles from the Oakland touchdown structures to the SAS span. Pile driving began in February of 2003, and by 2007, the Skyway was 75% complete. But this doesn't mean the first few years were problem-free. In 2005 alone, there were 2 notable interruptions to the process. The first was caused by the then governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger, who proposed a redesign for the SAS bridge itself. The proposal faced intense scrutiny, with a report warning of severe time and cost overruns. The same year, the FBI began to investigate allegations that welders were cutting corners in their work, which threatened the structural integrity of the new span. However, in a twist, the FBI closed the investigation, revealing that critical welds were actually 30% stronger than required. The entire Skyway project was officially wrapped by 2016. But how did they make it happen? The construction techniques were nothing short of genius. The team drove large-diameter tubular piles at angles due to weak soil conditions and barged in precast segments that were assembled using cantilever lifts. Now, let's talk about the star of the show, the SAS bridge itself. It boasted a unique self-anchored suspension design with a single asymmetrical tower tailored for the site's specific challenges. Construction on this main span began in 2008, featuring a main cable designed as a single loop, giving it the ability to sustain higher traffic volumes. In addition, the bridge's seismic design was top-notch, with energy-absorbing features that made it tough enough to withstand severe earthquakes. Thus, the original goal of the project was achieved. The tower construction started in 2010, and it went through multiple phases. On July of 28th that year, the team erected the first of 4 below-deck main tower pillars. By March of 2011, the tower stood tall at 480 feet, and by December 2011, it was complete. This also meant that cable installation could finally begin. The team used prefabricated mile-long cable bundles for efficiency instead of the traditional one-wire-at-a-time method. In total, 137 cable bundles were meticulously installed. By late May of 2012, the entire cable was being compressed into a sleek, circular shape and wrapped in a protective wire jacket. It truly was a sight to behold. Tensioning was performed individually on each suspender cable to evenly distribute the load, culminating on November 20th, 2012, when the SAS section became self-supporting. Meanwhile, the Oakland touchdown phase kicked off in 2009 and was completed in 2013. It focused on getting the eastbound traffic side finished by May of 2011. This involved crafting a curved elevated roadway linked to the existing road, completed in 2 phases to keep traffic flowing. By mid-March of 2013, the western portion was finished and the construction catwalks were removed, making way for the grand reveal. But what about the old eastern span? It began its slow farewell in January of 2012, with demolition estimates suggesting it would take a staggering 5 to 7 years to complete and cost. It began its slow farewell in January of 2012, with demolition estimates suggesting that it would take a staggering 5 to 7 years to complete and cost around $244 million. It was a high price tag to simply get rid of something. Over 8,000 workers built the original bridge, but the demolition was tackled by a lean crew of about 34-person teams. These workers, part of the CEC Silverado joint venture, handled the task like the seasoned pros they were. They were suspended 200 feet above the San Francisco Bay in man-lift baskets. They expertly cut the bridge apart with torches while crane operators skillfully maneuvered the steel. But it wasn't until January 28, 2014 that things got serious. Giant red jackhammers pounded away, making the old span shudder and vibrate. For months, commuters, cyclists, and runners all watched the dramatic transformation unfold. By June of 2015, the monumental cantilever section was officially done. Crews meticulously dismantled the structure in reverse order from how it was assembled back in the 1930s. This wasn't just any teardown. It involved high-wire acts, literally, while adhering to strict environmental safeguards. Still, everything went off without a hitch. Brian Maroney, the chief bridge engineer, noted the old steel was tired and cracked, but the demolition was completed on time, under budget, and without any accidents. By the end of 2015, Phase 1 of the demolition process wrapped, marking the removal of the entire cantilever section and the S-curve. 2 teams worked tirelessly on the suspended bridge while a third tackled the S-curve, a tricky detour to the Yerba Buena Tunnel. Removal of the S-curve was no easy feat, given its proximity to the new bridge and live traffic. But thanks to the use of 42-inch diameter false work, originally intended for the new Bay Bridge, the crew navigated the demolition relatively easily. Phase 2 targeted the removal of the colossal 1.7 million pound truss sections. This phase required not just strength, but also precise planning and coordination. As the old east span was dismantled, crews loaded materials onto barges for recycling. The use of the Enerpac hydraulic jackup system was a game-changer for lifting the truss sections. The multi-point lifting system featured 4 jackup towers under each corner of a load, providing stability and speed. With a lift capacity ranging from 125 to 750 tons, this tech slashed the time needed for each span removal. The teams were able to cut the span removal from 6 weeks to around 1 week per span. But the demolition wasn't without its unusual problems. On November 11th, 2017, some of the final remnants of the old bridge were set to be removed. But as the crews worked to demolish the marine foundations, they encountered a surprise visitor. A seal had wandered into the exclusion zone, causing a brief delay. Marine mammal watchers were brought on site to ensure safety protocols for the relocation of the seals were followed. Once the coast was clear, the final implosion went off without a hitch. In total, over 58,200 tons of steel and around 245,000 tons of concrete from the old eastern span were removed. On September 8, 2018, a series of controlled implosions marked the final act in the demolition saga of the Old Bay Bridge. The last remnants, Pier E19 and Pier E20, were removed from San Francisco Bay, officially ending a remarkable transformation that began with the construction of the new span between 2002 and 2013. In the early stages of the construction, Kenneth Terpstra of Caltrans said, "When this project opens to the public, they will be awed by what they behold." And that's precisely what happened. Since its completion, the Bay Bridge has flourished, accommodating increasing traffic with grace and reliability. As commuters enjoy the smoother ride and breathtaking views, the bridge stands as a testament to human ingenuity and collaboration, paving the way for a brighter, safer future. And it was all done without even stopping traffic. So there you have it, the tale of the efficient removal of the longest US bridge span in history, making way for something even greater. What do you think of this remarkable undertaking? Share your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always, thanks for watching and take care out there. The Panama Canal, a marvel of modern engineering, is a gateway for ships traveling between the Atlantic and Pacific. But beneath its smooth waters lies a history soaked in tragedy. At its narrowest, the Central American Isthmus spans just a few dozen miles of jungle, mountains, and swamp, a mere sliver of land connecting 2 continents. And these days, 32 ships a day glide through the canal, bypassing the treacherous Cape Horn. But building the Panama Canal wasn't just about breaking land. It was about breaking men. And today, we're going to show you how building a canal across the Isthmus of Panama became one of the most deadly engineering projects in human history. The strip of land the canal is built on is 30 miles across at its thinnest point. The canal itself is 50 miles from deep water in the Atlantic to deep water in the Pacific. Fortunately, to build the Panama Canal, engineers didn't have to start from scratch. The location of the canal coincides with the natural flow of the Chagres River. A key part of the canal's construction involved damming the Chagres to create a lake deep enough for massive boats to float through without running aground. This became Gatun Lake, which now takes up 160 square miles of flooded land. The original plans for the Panama Canal entailed digging into the earth 40 feet below sea level so the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific could mix. But as we'll see, that won't happen. Carving out the equivalent of a mountain was no easy task. Beyond that, engineers had to contend with the height difference between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It sounds strange that one ocean would have a higher sea level than the other, but it comes from a combination of factors, including ocean currents, variations in temperature and salinity affecting water density, as well as the Earth's rotation influencing ocean circulation, all of which combined lead to the Pacific Ocean being about 40 centimeters higher than the Atlantic. This was a problem, especially when there was already a mountain between them. The task of building the Panama Canal was quite steep, almost exactly as steep as the two mountain ranges looming over the side of the future canal, the Tabasara Mountains and the Cordillera de San Blas. Nearby, the Cerro Jefe mountain top towers over 3,300 feet above sea level. The canal was set to run from Limon Bay on the Caribbean Sea to Miraflores Lake by way of an artificial lake that was yet to be created. Over the course of 12 locks, any ship passing through the canal will be raised and lowered 85 feet above sea level to cross. Using the locking system, the canal's designers were able to circumvent the challenge of flattening the Continental Divide. The Continental Divide is the mountain range that determines if rainfall will drain towards the Atlantic or Pacific Oceans. So what does this mean? Building the Panama Canal meant flattening a section of a mountain range. More than just layers of rock and large boulders, the area was also a densely packed jungle, swarming with pests and large animals, huge trees, and thick brush. Beneath this stretch of land that would be carved up to create the canal, a bedrock of slate and shale stood between engineers and the route they imagined. The proposed site would follow the path of the Chagres River, but also a Spanish trade route called El Camino Real de Panama that connected Panama City on the Pacific coast with its trading partner, Portobello, on the Caribbean Sea. The Camino Real was the only road for people to move valuable goods such as gold and silver from coast to coast through Panama. In 1850, construction began on the Panama Railroad, a 47.5-mile route that cost a total of $8 million. An estimated 6,000 died building it. While this is a huge number of casualties for such a short stretch of rail, it's only a fraction of the number who would die to build a canal in the years to come. Building the canal along this route was a nod to Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the Spanish conquistador who established Spain's first South American settlement. He was the first European to set his eyes on the Pacific Ocean. When Balboa wrote back to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V with news of his discovery of an ocean, he was rewarded by becoming the governor of Panama. Balboa's expeditions and adventures to this region identified the most promising location for a direct passage towards Asia and Australia from Africa and Europe. But as a precursor to the devastation that would result from constructing the Panama Canal, the introduction of Spanish settlements decimated local populations. Additionally, Balboa brought enslaved African people to transport cargo along El Camino Real, establishing a new political, social, and cultural hierarchy that destroyed Panamanian beliefs as well as their native population. While the demographics of Panama changed drastically in the 19th century, its weather was quite consistent. Average temperatures in Panama linger around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and it averages about 105 inches of rainfall a year. It's wet, humid, and nearly impossible to cool off in. Flooding was a regular occurrence, especially in the wet season. The tropical weather was quite the adjustment for workers coming from Europe and the United States. Even for workers coming to construct the canal from Caribbean nations, the mountain jungles of Panama were a different beast. But with the Panama Canal, the main cause of death would come at the hands, or really the mouths, of tiny insects. Today we know that infected mosquitoes transmit malaria parasites and the yellow fever virus when they bite people. But in the 1850s, people had no understanding of how these debilitating diseases were transmitted. Many medical professionals believed malaria was caused by something airborne coming out of marshes. Just take a look at the word's Italian roots: bad, mal, and air, aria. Yellow fever was also thought to be the product of humid air mixing with undrained soil. While they were onto something by noticing trends about humid environments and illnesses, they were way off in their understanding of how these diseases worked. Scientist Louis Pasteur had just proposed a theory that microbial germs caused disease, not things floating in the air or imbalances in bodily fluids. His theory became known as germ theory and informs how we think about cleanliness today. It revolutionized how scientists understood disease and gave them a blueprint for how to combat sickness. Another medical breakthrough in the time of the Panama Canal's construction happened when a French doctor made an astonishing discovery while treating patients for what was then called marsh fever. We now know this to be malaria. Dr. Alphonse Leveron was studying a blood sample from a sick patient. He wanted to understand what caused the disease at a biological level rather than just blaming the air. He was eager to understand the root of the disease, not only so he could better treat his patients who had it, but so people could avoid whatever was causing it. One day, he identified tiny wriggling forms swimming in the bit of blood he was examining. Leveron drew the connection that the moving dots in the infected blood mimicked the patterns he had seen in parasites, but it would be more than 20 years until scientists confidently recognized that those parasites he spotted were the same as those that were found in mosquitoes. Around the turn of the century, people realized that these insects actually transmitted those diseases. At that point, tens of thousands of workers had already made the trek to the thick jungles to work on the construction of the Panama Canal. Thousands had died from malaria and yellow fever by the time science could explain how the diseases were spreading. By the 1870s, central Panama had a few built-up cities populated by a combination of European expats and formerly enslaved people. Steam locomotives now frequented ports in Panama City, San Miguelito, and Colón. More and more attention was directed to the development of Central America, and in the middle of the age of imperialism, powerful countries from around the world began taking an interest in the potential of an interoceanic canal. The pipe dream that Vasco Núñez de Balboa had all those years ago seemed like something that could actually happen, given the recent breakthrough in Egypt. The Suez Canal, which cuts through the Isthmus of Suez in Egypt, wrapped up its 10-year construction project in 1869. It was a feat of engineering the likes of which the world had never before seen. Built across a 120-mile stretch of flat desert, it was a long but relatively straightforward build, the brainchild of Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps. Following the opening of the Suez Canal, fleets of steamships were trimming over 5,000 nautical miles off of trips from India to Europe. New ships were being designed that could carry larger cargoes for shorter distances. Trade was flourishing and port economies were booming. Of course, there was the huge human cost to build it, and while the numbers are hard to pin down, some estimates put the numbers of workers killed at over 100,000. But the everyday utility of the Suez Canal made it easy to look past the cholera outbreaks and deadly work conditions that the Suez Canal's 1.5 million construction workers faced. And despite the heavy casualties of the Suez construction, there was no hesitation when the idea arose of doing something similar in Central America. Led once again by de Lesseps, the French broke ground on the canal in 1881. He estimated construction would cost $132 million and take 12 years to complete. It was a fraction of the size of the Suez Canal, but because the terrain was so inhospitable, he estimated it would take longer. While he was right about that, his estimates about the cost, both financial and human, were very off. Just months after starting work on the canal, the first case of yellow fever was recorded, coinciding with the start of the wet season. Fortunately, with the huge scale of the Panama Canal project came a huge influx of money, and that money went straight towards a hospital. But even with plenty of hospital beds and nurses, mosquitoes were wreaking havoc on workers. To add fuel to the flames, these hospitals willingly surrounded themselves with little channels of water. These were made to discourage ants from attacking their vegetable gardens, but ultimately, they became hotspots for mosquito colonies. As insects of all kinds became a larger and larger problem, hospital staff implemented every tactic they could think of to address the problem. For some reason, they thought that placing water pans under bedposts would keep insects away. They were wrong. Yellow fever, malaria, and other pathogenic illnesses became known as the tropic fever. And tropic fever became known for wiping out thousands of workers on the Panama Canal. People would vomit black fluids from bleeding stomachs and turn yellow with jaundice. Whether on-site on this isthmus or reading news of the conditions thousands of miles away, everyone started to realize the dangers of working in the tropics. Contractors who feared for their own lives kept dropping out of the project to the frustration of Ferdinand de Lesseps. But even with regular leadership turnover, excavation projects continued. At its peak employment levels, the French employed more than 19,000 people, bringing in workers from Caribbean islands, primarily Jamaica. More and more people were being brought in, which meant that disease-carrying mosquitoes had more and more bodies to feed on. On top of that, a civil war broke out in the city of Cologne. In early 1885, revolts broke out in response to the newly elected president. Revolutionaries opposed to the new government briefly took over Cologne, a key port city for the shipping of materials to build the canal. Rebels attempted to take over a shipment of American weapons and kept the men who refused to hand over the weapons as hostages. A battle broke out between the rebels, and Panamanian troops and U.S. seamen fought to protect their own interests. Eventually, tensions settled, but not before a massive fire swept through the city, decimating infrastructure and leaving thousands of workers homeless. As years rolled on and the death toll rose, progress plateaued. As of July 1885, only about 1/10 of the estimated total de Lesseps projected had been excavated. The French team were over budget, underperforming, and responsible for what is estimated to be the deaths of nearly 20,000 people. As logistical, natural, and architectural difficulties challenged the progress of de Lesseps' design, he refused to adjust his vision for a sea-level canal. So, more cohorts of workers would roll in and less would return home. De Lesseps wanted the canal entirely at sea level, like what he had done with the Suez, but his ambition exceeded the ability of the technology he had and the labor force he was working with. Unless his dynamite could explode 10 times more forcibly or his workers developed a sudden immunity to tropic fever, the Panama Canal seemed doomed. In May of 1889, all activity on the isthmus ceased. The French had to abandon the project that was supposed to be a home run for them. Tropic fever, inadequate medicine, and a poor understanding of science are in some ways responsible for the steep death toll of the Panama Canal. But other factors relating to the intense nature of the construction project led to many accidents that would claim more lives. Even after control of the project switched hands to American engineers who implemented mosquito control measures, the Panama Canal would still go on to claim thousands more lives. When the U.S. took over the project in 1904, local Panamanian residents avoided participating in the building of the canal. They had witnessed the death that accompanied the first attempt to build the canal and wanted nothing to do with it. As a result, American and British contractors decided to import labor once again, primarily from the Antilles. Housing facilities were inadequate and food was sparse. At its busiest, up to 40,000 people were working on the canal at a given time. Generally, workers were contracted to 2-year stays. They would work for 4,500 hours over the course of their 2 years at a fixed rate of 10 cents per hour. A combination of language barriers, cultural differences, and racial animosity created social rifts between Americans, Panamanians, and Caribbean workers. When a crisis struck, be it an outbreak of disease or a tragic accident, these tensions only contributed to a deeper sense of unrest and frustration. But one notable shift that occurred after the Americans took over was the death toll linked to mosquito-borne diseases. When they took over the project, some people at the time jokingly considered yellow fever to be the first mountain to be removed. This made light in some ways of the fact that the canal's mission was to decimate a mountain, but acknowledged that getting a handle on the insect problem was paramount to connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. U.S. authorities created the Isthmian Canal Commission to control the outbreak of yellow fever and malaria. By the time the 1900s came about, scientists were quite certain about the link between mosquito bites and the transmission of diseases. They set up a clear protocol for how to implement mosquito control. All pools in close proximity to houses and villages were drained. Brush and grass was cut to be less than a foot high. Buildings added insect screens to their windows and drains to stop mosquitoes from getting in. Quality of life improved as health standards soared. But while deaths by disease went down, the nature of the project itself grew increasingly difficult. In 1909, accidents overtook disease as the leading cause of death. In some ways, this was an exciting milestone that was testament to the power of mosquito control and advances in science. At the same time, it highlighted just how deadly it was to be a part of building the Panama Canal. In the course of moving hundreds of thousands of pounds of dirt, landslides and mudslides were frequent. Workers chipping away at the side of a mountain could be buried alive in a moment when a cascade of rocks tumbled down. When the United States took over the Panama Canal's construction in 1904, they could build off the partially excavated ditch the French had chipped away at. But they needed a new plan if they wanted to have anything more than dirt. 240 million cubic yards of rock and dirt were excavated under the Americans' command. With that many rocks to move, many people were injured, buried, and killed. Of the 56,000 workers employed between 1904 and 1913, the U.S. recorded that 5,855 canal workers were killed. The most deadly section of the Panama Canal's construction was the Culebra Cut. Spanning the Continental Divide, the Culebra Cut was the tallest landmass workers had to cut through. It was such a monumental task that those working on the project referred to it as Hell's Gorge. The section of mountainous land workers would need to excavate was almost 9 miles long. At its highest point, the mountain that workers needed to cut through was 335.5 feet above sea level. This wasn't going to be easy. Crews blasted the mountain with explosives. They used steam shovels to load loosened dirt into railroad cars, which would then carry it away. New machines like dirt spreaders, unloaders, and railroad track shifters helped the crew manage huge loads and find spaces to redeposit dirt from the canal's excavation. These machines could do the work of hundreds of men in just a few hours, but efficiency didn't necessarily mean things were safer. Using this heavy equipment high up on the canal's wall left workers in compromised positions. Unstable ground would regularly give way and people would be crushed or fall to their deaths. When heavy rains brought sudden floodwaters or mudslides, works on the floor of the canal could be buried. Some died of electrocution, others drowned. Once, an excavating machine accidentally set off some explosives and 23 men died as a result. Every construction accident that you can imagine happened while trying to create the Culebra Cut. Work in the canal was loud and hot. Workers were exhausted and eager to finish the project. As one of the mosquito control measures, workers were encouraged to drink quinine as an anti-malaria measure. But quinine treatment tended to cause high-tone hearing loss, and for workers navigating crowded construction sites with loud machinery echoing through the tunnel-like walls of the canal, it was easy to miss a message about where to stand and when to duck. The chaotic environment at the bottom of the canal lent itself to accidents. But work went on, with the final goal of creating a pass that was 300 feet wide and 45 feet deep. Crews had to move a lot of dirt. It's estimated that over 60 million pounds of dynamite were used to make the Culebra Cut alone. Even with the temperatures soaring over 100 degrees, workers managed to lower the floor of the excavation site to within 40 feet of sea level. There's more to the Panama Canal than just its excavation. Construction of the Gatun Dam was essential for the Panama Canal's updated design. This earthen dam was a make-or-break feature of the canal. If it worked, it would create a man-made lake that would let boats pass the Continental Divide without having to level it to sea level. The plan was to dam the Gatun Lake at a height of 85 feet above sea level. To get boats up to the lake and lowered back down to sea level, engineers planned to use a series of locks to raise and lower ships. This way, they could use water control to push boats up higher rather than having to cut deeper into the unforgiving landscape. Construction of the locks began in 1909 and would wrap up in 1913 when work on the Culebra Cut and Gatun Dam also finished. A total of 46 gates keep sections of the canal at the proper height. To move a ship from one end of the canal to another, 52 million gallons of water are used. The exchange of water from one lock to the other takes a much smaller toll than the casualties that would have inevitably come about from trying to make the canal at sea level. Having control over the flow of water by using locks has proven to be useful for managing traffic through the canal. It also lessened the possibility that flooding in the wet season or a dry spell might leave the canal drained or impassable with rapids. The canal's construction not only changed the geography of the Isthmus of Panama, but also changed trade routes, balances of power between nations, and how humans approach nature. Over the course of the 30 years that it was built, machinery improved, engineering advanced, and we learned how to control previously unknown diseases. Once it was constructed, the Panama Canal was considered a triumph of the tropics, but it came at quite a high price of 25,000 human lives. If you're interested in more stories of doomed construction projects, check out The Real Reason Why Italy's Plan to Build a Bridge to Sicily Won't Work, or the real reason there is no bridge between Russia and Alaska. Thanks for watching. A man's hands tremble as he gingerly inserts nitroglycerin into a hole drilled in the rock. Suspended high above the treacherous Sierra Nevada wilderness in a basket woven from reeds, he gazes up at the sheer, unforgiving granite cliff face towering above him. The hiss of a match is followed by the sputter of a fuse catching flame. He sends his signal, a loud whistle, for the men holding the basket to begin pulling him up. He can only hope that they heard him over the wind as the fire begins creeping towards the explosives. But the basket doesn't move. He whistles again as the flame continues to move closer and closer to the hole in the cliff, but still his basket doesn't move. His pulse pounds in his ears. He whistles frantically and begins to shout, "What could be happening? What could be happening? Is this how it will end for him? Blown apart on the side of a cliff in the middle of nowhere, 1,000 miles from his home?" But then, a sudden tug on the rope jolts him back to hope. The basket begins to ascend, agonizingly, achingly slow. His eyes shut tight. He braces for the explosion, his breath caught in his chest, wondering if he'll make it out alive. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was a feat of human might, ambition, and engineering, as well as a story of unbelievable corruption and death. Today, we're going to dive into the brave people, the great race, and the horrific tragedies that created the railroad which connected the entire United States. Come along to discover the story of how the Transcontinental Railroad was built. Long before California became a part of the United States, one man envisioned a radical idea that would change the course of history. Merchant Asa Whitney dreamed of a railroad connecting the West Coast to the rest of the country. In 1844, while returning from a trade expedition to China, Whitney had an epiphany. What if America could build a railroad stretching east to west and open up the enormous trade possibilities with the Chinese market? Back then, a trip from New York to the west coast of the United States meant one of three things. One choice was sailing to the Isthmus of Panama, unloading yourself and your cargo, trekking across the sweltering, dangerous jungle by land, and then reloading everything on another ship to continue the voyage. Another was to embark on a months-long sea voyage, enduring rough waters and freezing winds as you sailed all the way around the southern tip of South America, Cape Horn. The third option was to brave the Oregon Trail, a grueling overland trek filled with treacherous terrain, harsh weather, and the constant risk of exhaustion or attack. Ships took 43 days from New York to San Francisco through the Isthmus and 198 days from New York to Monterey around South America's Cape Horn. Survival was not guaranteed, as Cape Horn's waters famously wrecked over 800 ships since the 1500s. The Oregon Trail was also fraught with danger. The journey was long, taking 4 to 6 months on average. If travelers didn't die of cholera or dysentery, there was a chance of starvation or freezing to death. Asa Whitney knew there must be a better way to go west. So, in 1845, he petitioned Congress for land along a route west from Lake Michigan to build his railroad, and promised that it would be self-financing. Settlers would buy up land along the railroad tracks, and that money would go to construction. When Congress reviewed Asa Whitney's bold proposal, they didn't just reject it, they dismissed it as pure fantasy. The first steam train in the US had only started operating in 1830, and it trundled along 13 miles of track from Baltimore to some local mills. The idea of building a railroad across the entire, vast, little understood western US seemed outlandish. But Asa Whitney was not one to give up easily. Undeterred by rejection, he embarked on a relentless 6-year publicity campaign, tirelessly advocating for his vision of a transcontinental railroad. Yet, despite his determination, Congress rejected his proposal one final time in 1851. Whitney walked away, never knowing that his dream, dismissed as impossible, would soon inspire others to turn it into reality. In 1848, the discovery of gold in the West set off a frenzy. Thousands of prospectors flooded into California, chasing dreams of fortune and a better life. Among those watching the chaos unfold was businessman Charles Lincoln Wilson, who realized something critical. The West needed a way to connect to these bustling hubs. A railroad wasn't just an idea anymore, it was a necessity. In 1854, he hired a young railroad surveyor out of New York, Theodore Judah, to go out to California and figure out how to build it. No one knew that this small project would turn into something much bigger, and Judah's name would go down in history. Under Judah's direction, the Sacramento Valley Railroad was built, linking the goldfields to Sacramento. And through that, the young engineer realized he wanted to take on a much bigger project, the Transcontinental Railroad. He proposed his plan to Washington, but though Congress was more open to the idea now, they had a different issue with it. Northern politicians fiercely opposed any route through the South, fearing it would enrich the slave-owning states that were already threatening secession. Meanwhile, Southern politicians refused to support a northern route, unwilling to hand economic power to their ideological enemy. Desperate to break the deadlock, Judah proposed a daring compromise, a railroad along the 41st parallel, splitting the difference between North and South. But when the politicians heard his plan, it was immediately dismissed. Judah's line would have to cross several deep ravines and go right through the granite Sierra Nevada mountain range. It would require an engineering accomplishment that had literally never been done before in the US. But Judah was convinced his route was best. He just needed to find a way to cross the steep, unruly Sierras. Chance brings him a Dutch flat storekeeper named Daniel Doc Strong, who told Judah he knew the best way to cross the mountains, through the Donner Pass. Judah checked the site and realized he had found his path, but there was still the problem of funding. In 1860, he lobbied the businessmen of Sacramento for funds, and eventually found 4 visionaries who shared his belief in the railroad's potential: Charles Crocker, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, and Mark Hopkins. Together, they became known as the Big Four. Judah was promised an equivalent number of shares as the businessmen, but their working relationship would soon turn sour. However, on the political side, a big breakthrough came about. On July 1, 1862, President Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. Trying to keep afloat in the middle of the Civil War, Lincoln believed a transcontinental railroad would unite the country, joining East and West and proving the U.S. could function as a whole. Also, a recent, surprising important invention had come about that would allow the railroad to be built: the telegraph. The first transcontinental telegraph line was completed in 1861. It allowed almost instantaneous communication between engineers, company leaders, and workers in the field could now communicate across vast distances with precision. It was a feat that had been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Judah was exhilarated by the passage of the Railway Act, but knew there was still a lot of work ahead. He telegraphed his partners and said, "We have drawn the elephant. Now let us see if we can harness him up." The Pacific Railway Act stated that 2 companies would build the railroad, one heading east from Sacramento and the other heading west from the Missouri River. According to the act, companies could claim subsidies in the form of bonds and federal lands. They stood to gain 6,400 acres for every mile of track laid, $16,000 in bonds per mile in subsidies for flatland, $32,000 per mile laid in foothills, and $48,000 per mile laid in mountainous terrain. At that time, $48,000 was equal to almost $1.4 million in today's money. These incentives ignited a fierce competition between 2 railroad companies, each racing to lay track faster and farther than the other. The prize? Vast stretches of land and lucrative government bonds that could make or break their fortunes. Lincoln approved a planned route suggested by engineer Grenville Dodge that would start from Council Bluffs, Iowa, and head west along the North Fork in Nebraska. These plans would soon be challenged due to one man's greed. But for now, the stage was set for one of the greatest competitions the world had ever seen. On January 8, 1863, the Central Pacific Railroad, the CPRR, broke ground in Sacramento on the line that would connect the entire United States. Later that same year in December, the Union Pacific Railroad, the UPRR, would celebrate its own launch going westwards from Omaha, Nebraska. The race to build the Transcontinental Railroad was on. Though CPRR had a head start, they also had a drawback. The western route had significantly harder terrain, including ravines and mountains. But the first hiccup happened on the Union Pacific side, and it was a major one. Even though the company celebrated the start of its work in December of 1863, it didn't actually lay its first track until July 10, 1865. The primary cause of these delays was Thomas C. Durant, a local businessman and former doctor. Durant circumvented regulations limiting stock purchases, acquiring a majority stake in Union Pacific. Once in control, he focused on leveraging the company to serve his own financial interests, delaying progress on the project. Durant first used his influence to move the starting point of the railroad to Omaha, where he had business interests, raising questions from his head engineer. Starting from Omaha also sidestepped having to build a river bridge from Council Bluffs to Omaha. And this was far from the only controversial action Durant would take. Unwilling to risk his own money on the railroad's construction, Durant created a company called Credit Mobilier of America to absorb the financial risk. While it appeared to be an independent contractor, Credit Mobilier was in reality a front managed by Union Pacific investors, including Durant himself, several other businessmen, and even members of Congress. The company charged the government ridiculously high fees in order to pocket the difference and ensure investors would make money off each day of construction before the railroad was even completed. Meanwhile, the ongoing Civil War tied up most of the private capital that the company was counting on to help fund the railroad. While the Central Pacific Company was making better progress, it was slow going. The railroad had to make its way through the 14,000-foot-plus Sierra Nevada range, made mostly of granite. Corruption also wasn't limited to the eastern side of the railroad. On the western front, tensions grew within the Central Pacific, as Judah and the Big Four found themselves increasingly at odds. Judah discovered that his partners were exploiting loopholes, awarding lucrative contracts to their own businesses, and manipulating facts to inflate their profits. The Big Four quickly realized how to manipulate the Pacific Railway Act grant system for greater profit. By claiming that the Sierra foothills began several miles earlier than they actually did, they secured more money from the government. Under the grant system, tracks laid in foothills earned double the bonds of those on flat land. With the American West still largely unsurveyed and poorly understood at the time, there was little scrutiny of their claims, allowing them to exploit the system without challenge. Judah spoke out forcefully against the growing corruption within the Central Pacific, refusing to remain silent as his partners exploited the project for personal gain. His resistance, however, was met with a stark ultimatum: align with their schemes or sell his stake in the company, despite the fact that the railroad had been his vision from the beginning. Determined to take back control, Judah made the arduous journey across the Isthmus of Panama in 1863 to reach New York, where he hoped to find new investors who shared his commitment to the project's integrity. Unfortunately, he would never make it back to see his dream become a reality. He contracted yellow fever in Panama, becoming sick for weeks before eventually dying in a hotel room in New York. The Central Pacific Railroad was now encountering a far greater obstacle: a severe labor shortage. The grueling work conditions, endless hours under scorching valley suns and in freezing mountain winds with no clear end date in sight, made it nearly impossible to attract workers. The uncertainty of how many years the construction might last only compounded the difficulty, as few were willing to endure such punishing environments for an indefinite period. By early 1865, 1965, the Big Four estimated they needed 4,000 workers to meet the demands of construction. Yet, at any given time, they had only 800 laborers, the majority of whom were Irish immigrants. As the railroad pushed eastward toward the California-Nevada border, the labor shortage worsened. Many workers, tempted by the prospect of striking it rich in nearby gold and silver mines, abandoned their posts in droves, leaving the Central Pacific scrambling to keep construction on track. Laborers also started demanding more money, putting a further strain on finances. By 1865, the labor shortage had reached a crisis point, leaving foremen and owners at a loss for solutions. It was then that Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four, proposed an idea to work manager James Strobridge hire some of the thousands of Chinese immigrants living in California. Strobridge, however, resisted the idea. His stubbornness, combined with deeply ingrained prejudices, led him to dismiss the Chinese workers as unfit for such demanding labor. But seeing no other solution, Strobridge relented and hired 50 Chinese men on a trial basis. Eventually, Chinese people would make up the majority of Central Pacific Railroad workers, some of them brought directly from China. The Chinese workers faced appalling treatment on the railroad. Initially paid $27 a month, later increased to $30, they were required to cover the cost of their own room and board. In contrast, Irish workers earned $35 a month, with room and board fully provided. To accommodate cultural preferences, the Chinese workers had supplies brought in from cities like San Francisco, as the standard meals of boiled meat and potatoes provided to the Irish were unappealing to them. The owners, however, viewed this disparity as a strategic advantage. They noted that the Irish workers, fearing replacement by the Chinese laborers, stopped demanding higher wages, effectively suppressing calls for better pay across the workforce. Now the workers had a huge task in front of them. 15 tunnels needed to be blasted through the mountains. Workers first started constructing tunnels using hand tools like hammers and chisels. Managers quickly realized this method would severely delay progress, but thankfully, a new substance had just made the papers. On Monday, April 16, 1866, a worker at the San Francisco Wells Fargo building attempted to open a leaking crate. Moments later, the building was obliterated in a massive explosion that killed everyone inside and shook structures several yards away. Inside the crate was nitroglycerin. This volatile substance, invented in 1847 and recently refined by Alfred Nobel, was a groundbreaking but deadly new product. Its power was unmatched, but so was its unpredictability. The news of the devastating nitroglycerin explosion in San Francisco reached the Central Pacific executives and inspired a dangerous idea. They realized this volatile substance could be used to blast through the granite walls blocking their progress. To carry out the plan, Chinese workers crafted baskets using traditional reed weaving methods and were lowered in them over sheer granite cliffs, dangling thousands of feet above the ground. Suspended in midair, they chiseled holes into the rock, inserted nitroglycerin and black powder, lit the fuse, and trusted their co-workers holding the ropes to pull them up in time. Tragically, mistakes were common, and death became an all-too-frequent part of the job. Of all the obstacles, the Donner Pass was the most difficult of all. Workers had to burrow through 1,659 feet, or over 500 meters of solid granite, the length of over 1.5 Eiffel Towers, all at an altitude of 7,000 feet. As snow pummeled them during the winter, work progressed slowly, 14 inches or 35 centimeters a day, as workers struggled to break the rock. Meanwhile, below freezing temperatures and avalanches killed dozens, if not hundreds. Faced with the immense challenge of tunneling through the granite at Donner Summit Pass, workers devised an innovative solution. They dug a 75-foot vertical shaft straight down into the tunnel. This alone took 3 grueling months to complete. Once the shaft was finished, it allowed teams to dig from the inside out as well as from the outside in, effectively doubling the rate of construction. Progress increased to 28 inches a day, a significant improvement in one of the most challenging sections of the railroad. All in all, the construction of the pass cost between $150,000 and $1 million per mile. To top it off, the crew also had to build tall wooden snow sheds over a distance of 40 miles to keep the construction and track area clear of avalanches and snowdrifts, which could get to dozens of feet high. After 15 grueling months, the Donner Pass summit tunnels had been completed. But Chinese workers decided they had had enough of risking their lives, terrible working conditions, and lesser pay than their white co-workers. They went on strike. In a shockingly inhumane move, company managers withheld food until the strike broke. But it was the first sign of many to come that foreign workers would not take exploitation lying down. While the Central Pacific Railroad was moving agonizingly slowly, the Union Pacific finally got around to starting. In 1864, Congress amended the Pacific Railway Act to make more money and land available to the companies working on the track. They also extended the deadline for the first 50-mile section of track needed to qualify for the land grant to 1865. This gave Union Pacific the money to start work again. One of the other problems that had stalled construction from Omaha was a lack of labor. It was harder to get Chinese people from China to the Missouri River, so UPRR couldn't follow Central Pacific's solution. But once the Civil War ended, a whole lot of soldiers found themselves out of the army and jobless. Newly freed Black Americans also needed work. Seizing the chance, UPRR hired Civil War veterans and Black Americans, along with Irish, Italian, and German immigrants from the Northeast, to fill its labor force and push construction forward. Although the workers from Union Pacific had the advantage of crossing the seemingly endless flat plains of the Midwest, the terrain presented its own set of challenges. First, laying track required vast amounts of timber and other resources. These materials had to be transported from the Missouri River across great distances to reach the construction sites on the prairies, creating significant logistical challenges. Workers also faced frequent attacks from Native American tribes. For the indigenous peoples of the plains, the railroad symbolized a direct threat to their lands, resources, and way of life, further straining relations that were already fractured. By the mid-19th century, the U.S. government's policies toward indigenous populations, such as the forced removal of tribes from their ancestral lands, exemplified by the Trail of Tears, had created deep mistrust and hostility. This tension often boiled over into violent confrontations along the railroad's path. Native Americans were justifiably suspicious of this new government-spearheaded project crossing their lands. They thought the railroad would pose a threat to their lands and way of life. Unfortunately, they had no idea just how correct they were. To the railroad companies, indigenous peoples were viewed as obstacles to progress. In response to frequent raids, the U.S. government deployed military leaders like General William Tecumseh Sherman to suppress resistance and protect the construction efforts. Sherman's approach to indigenous resistance was marked by brutal and unapologetic violence. His infamous quote from 1867 encapsulates his attitude, quote, "The more we can kill this year, the less will have to be killed the next year." Skirmishes along the railroad construction route were frequent, as the U.S. Army clashed with Sioux, Arapaho, and Cheyenne tribes whose lands were being encroached upon. The U.S. military also enlisted the aid of Pawnee warriors, who had long-standing conflicts with some of the other tribes in the region. These battles often escalated into horrific tragedies. One of the most infamous was the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, where U.S. Army forces attacked a Cheyenne village, killing an estimated 150 to 200 people, many of them women and children. In retaliation, Cheyenne warriors launched an attack on soldiers stationed at Fort Rankin in Julesburg, Colorado, intensifying the cycle of violence along the construction route. As the tracks crossed west, Native Americans also sabotaged railroad work. They derailed handcars, turned up the tracks themselves and piled ties between them to create blockades, and attacked white settlements that had sprung up along the route. As the tracks crossed west, temporary towns sprung up following the railroad workers. They had blacksmith shops, doctors' offices, and other stores, sometimes set up in temporary wooden structures, other times in tents. But they became famous for their less wholesome offerings. offerings, mostly gambling and prostitution. These settlements were nicknamed Hell on Wheels towns, as they catered to groups of young single men with money in their pocket and nothing to do after work. Some of those temporary settlements turned into major towns across the Great Plains, like Cheyenne and Laramie in Wyoming. At this point, despite their late start, the Union Pacific Company was moving 4 times as fast as the Central Pacific, so the Central Pacific became even more determined to catch up. In 1866, Congress amended the Pacific Railway Act again and set the specific meeting point aside. They told the companies to just build as much railway as they could. The company that built the most would get the most money and land. This put the competition between the two companies into overdrive. The Union Pacific decided to set a record, laying 8 miles of track in one day. Central Pacific heard about this accomplishment thanks to the magic of the telegraph and decided they would lay 10 miles in one day to beat their rivals. 8 workers placed over 3,500 rails down, while their co-workers drove around 28,000 spikes and laid 25,800 ties down at the same time. Each spike usually took about a minute for a skilled worker to drive into the ground, so the output that day was equal to almost 20 days of work by a single worker. But even with this new incentive, the landscape of the West was still daunting. Big challenges lay ahead, namely in the ravines and rivers that had to be crossed. Most bridge construction at the time wasn't meant to carry steam locomotives full of passengers and cargo. Those wooden crossings would buckle immediately on the first train ride. The engineers needed a new design. Thankfully, William Howe had patented a new truss design for bridges that could carry heavy loads. It used a relatively small amount of wood for the support it provided, and added iron into the mix. Workers would construct wood and iron triangles stacked against each other in an interlocking way that provided major support to even the tallest, longest bridges of the time. The CPRR, eager to secure more money and land, often faced delays in receiving iron for construction. As a result, some of their bridges, designed to include iron for structural support, were instead built hastily with wood. This shortcut wasn't unique to CPRR. Union Pacific faced similar challenges. Bridges like the Dry Creek Bridge built by CPRR and the Dale Creek Bridge by UPRR were among those that had to be rebuilt with iron after the railroad's completion to ensure long-term safety. Once the Central Pacific cleared the almost impenetrable Sierras, their work advanced quickly against the relatively flat Great Basin. Union Pacific, meanwhile, had stalled in mountains northeast of the Great Salt Lake. As Central Pacific workers advanced rapidly toward Utah, their progress only intensified the rivalry with Union Pacific. Both companies were eager to outpace the other, and neither could agree on a meeting point. In their determination to claim as much land and funding as possible, both companies began surveying and even grading land beyond each other's completed tracks. Had they not been forced to stop, they likely would have continued building right past one another, ignoring the original goal of a unified railroad. So, in March 1869, with the two tracks just miles apart, President Ulysses S. Grant threatened to withhold funds until Central and Union Pacific agreed on a meeting point. They finally decided on the Promontory Summit. On May 10, 1869, as workers laid down the last set of tracks, the trains that had been following just behind them inched towards each other. To commemorate the joining of the tracks, a 17.6-carat golden spike was created, a gift from a California businessman to mark the historic occasion. Leland Stanford, one of the Big Four, was given the honor of driving the final spike. However, in a less than graceful moment, his swing missed and struck the tie instead. Thomas Durant, arriving hungover, made his attempt next, but failed to connect with the spike entirely. In the end, it was a railroad worker who stepped in to complete the task, ensuring the tracks were finally joined, a moment symbolic of the labor and effort that truly built the railroad. The Transcontinental Railroad was complete. All in all, Union Pacific had laid down over 1,086 miles of track from Omaha, and Central Pacific had laid down 690 miles of track from Sacramento. History was made. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad transformed life in the United States, reshaping the nation's economy, society, and geography in ways that are difficult to fully grasp today. It connected coasts, opened new frontiers, and fueled unprecedented growth and prosperity, laying the foundation for the modern United States. Resources, goods, and people started shuttling back and forth between the two coasts of the country at a scale never seen before, and at a cost 85% lower than traveling by stagecoach. A relatively risky trip that had previously taken months was now reduced to just 1 week. In 1870, a trip from New York to San Francisco took 5 to 7 days on the train, and tickets sold for $65 a person, or $136 for first class. Previously, people spent almost $1,000 to go west from New York, and the journey took 3 times longer than Columbus's first trip to America. California turned from being a semi-frontier country to one of the most economically important states of the U.S. Many western and midwestern states became more populated by European Americans and immigrants, as over 7,000 hell-on-wheels towns, water stops, and Union Pacific depots grew into permanent cities and villages. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad brought about an unexpected innovation: time zones. Before the railroad, over 8,000 towns in the western U.S. operated on their own local time. This patchwork of local times made coordinating train schedules nearly impossible. To solve this, the railroad industry pushed the country to adopt standard time zones. But perhaps most impressively of all, the railroad united the U.S. as a country, mentally as much as physically. The cross-country journey that used to be so intimidating became a short trip, making East and West seem much closer, as well as be much closer than ever before. But the human cost of the project was tragic. While companies didn't keep good records of deaths and injuries on the job, historians estimate that between 1,000 and 1,200 workers died during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Most of them were Chinese workers, who were discriminated against and tasked with the most dangerous jobs. Worst of all, the fears of Native American tribes in the area came to pass in horrific ways. White settlements flooded into previously native land, creating more government pressure on indigenous people to move, and more conflict between settlers and Native Americans. The railroad also decimated local buffalo populations, a major source of food, clothing, and other life-sustaining products for prairie tribes. Buffalo wouldn't cross the track, which cut off a lot of access to food and water. Furthermore, companies started advertising buffalo hunting expeditions out west, many of them taking place from the train itself, with people shooting at herds from the comfort of their seat. This wiped out millions of buffalo, leading to their near extinction by the end of the 19th century. With their local source of food and income devastated, the tribes were weakened and unable to mount much resistance to the white settlers overrunning their lands. As far as the men who completed the railroad, it took over a century for the contribution of immigrant workers, especially Chinese laborers and Black Americans, to truly be acknowledged. In the celebratory photos taken at Promontory Point, almost all non-white laborers are out of frame. The railroad to the outside world seemed to be the accomplishment of mostly white Americans, even though it was anything but. Between 13,000 and 20,000 Chinese workers are estimated to have contributed to the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Despite their critical role in completing this monumental project and enduring years of discrimination, their efforts were not met with gratitude, but with further injustice. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, barring Chinese immigrants from becoming U.S. citizens. This act marked the first major federal law to restrict immigration based on nationality, further marginalizing the very workers who had helped shape the nation's future. The Transcontinental Railroad was a massive achievement and awe-inspiring accomplishment that changed the course of history, though it didn't happen without long-reaching negative effects and a significant dark side. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack. You step onto a high-speed train in New York City, grab a coffee, settle into your seat, and close your eyes. Before you know it, you're stepping off in London. just a few hours later. No jet lag, no airport security, no turbulence. Just a smooth, futuristic ride beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Instead of staring out at clouds from an airplane window, you're watching the deep blue abyss, teeming with marine life, as your train glides through a marvel of human engineering. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, right? That's because, well, it is. A tunnel connecting the United States and Europe is an idea that has fascinated engineers, travelers, and futurists for decades. The benefits would be enormous: faster travel, increased trade, and a massive reduction in carbon emissions. But no matter how appealing the idea is, it's riddled with challenges so enormous that it remains an impossible dream, at least for now. So why hasn't this happened? And why won't it happen anytime soon? Let's break down the obstacles, the wild proposals, and the far-off future where such a project might just become possible. What would possibly make this Herculean task worth the effort? Well, there are several compelling reasons that make this project intriguing, especially when we look at it through the lens of trade, tourism, and sustainability. One of the most obvious reasons is trade. The United States and Europe are two of the world's largest economic powerhouses, and their trade relationship is massive. According to the Office of the United States Trade Representative, trade in goods and services between the US and the European Union in 2022 exceeded a staggering $1.3 trillion per year. Most of this trade occurs through cargo ships and air freight, both of which have their limitations. Cargo ships are slow and expensive to maintain, while air freight can be costly and often unreliable, especially when weather and logistical issues come into play. A high-speed tunnel running under the Atlantic could completely revolutionize the way goods are transported between these two regions. A system where goods could be shipped at lightning speeds would cut down on both transportation time and costs. It's easy to see how this could significantly boost international trade, benefiting businesses, consumers, and economies on both sides of the Atlantic. The ability to move goods quickly and efficiently across such a great distance would be a game-changer, enhancing global commerce in ways we've never seen before. Then, there's tourism. Every year, 12 million people travel back and forth across the Atlantic, and the vast majority rely on air travel. But flying between Europe and the US comes with its own set of challenges, from delays to turbulence and rising costs. They're expensive, time-consuming, and often subject to delays caused by weather, airport congestion, and other unforeseen circumstances. A high-speed tunnel could transport passengers across the ocean in just a few hours. The ability to book a simple, efficient train ride instead of an expensive flight could make international travel more accessible and less taxing. The tunnel could provide a more predictable, stable, and even cheaper way to travel, opening up more options for tourists and business people alike. What's more, the environmental impact of such a tunnel would be significant. Air travel is one of the leading contributors to global carbon emissions. With increasing concerns about climate change, finding more sustainable travel options has never been more urgent. Planes burn enormous amounts of fuel, and that fuel consumption contributes to the global warming crisis. But if the tunnel were powered by renewable energy, solar, wind, or even tidal, a high-speed train running on clean electricity could revolutionize transatlantic travel, slashing its carbon footprint in the process. All these points make the idea of an Atlantic tunnel sound incredibly promising. The potential benefits are immense. It could revolutionize international trade, make transatlantic travel far more efficient and sustainable, and provide a major boost to environmental efforts. On paper, it seems like a no-brainer, a groundbreaking innovation that could reshape the way we live, work, and travel. But, as we know, big ideas are often easier to dream up than to execute. The idea of digging a tunnel under the Atlantic Ocean comes with a staggering list of challenges that make it, quite frankly, nearly impossible. We'll need to talk about these obstacles, because while the benefits are tantalizing, the reality of constructing such a tunnel involves navigating some massive hurdles. From extreme depth and water pressure to the technical challenges of tunneling through such a vast body of water, there are many aspects of this dream that could quickly turn into a nightmare. Let's dive on into the challenges that would make this project not just difficult, but likely unfeasible. The sheer distance and cost involved in creating a transatlantic tunnel are enough to make anyone question whether it's even remotely possible. Let's break it down and see just how massive this project would be. The Atlantic Ocean is one of the largest bodies of water on Earth, and attempting to tunnel through it is a monumental challenge. The shortest distance between the US and mainland Europe is around 3,000 miles, which already puts the scale of the project into perspective. For comparison, the Channel Tunnel that connects the UK and France at just 31 miles long is a fraction of the distance needed for a transatlantic tunnel. Hailed as a remarkable engineering feat, it pales in comparison to the sheer scale of what crossing the Atlantic would require, at least 100 times longer than any underwater tunnel ever attempted. It's not just about length, though. The ocean floor presents its own set of challenges. The depth of the ocean varies greatly, with some parts plunging as deep as 12,000 feet. That means any tunnel would need to contend with extreme pressure and the technical challenges that come with working at such great depths. The seabed also varies from rocky terrain to soft sediments, each presenting its own difficulties in terms of digging and stabilizing the tunnel. Apart from this, another obstacle is the geopolitical and political complexities involved. Building a tunnel under the Atlantic Ocean would require unprecedented cooperation between countries, including the United States, Canada, the UK, and several European nations. The Atlantic Ocean isn't just a body of water, it's a major boundary between multiple nations, each with its own political agendas, regulatory systems, and priorities. For starters, there's the issue of land rights and sovereignty. The United States and European nations have established maritime borders, and these boundaries would need to be reconsidered when constructing a tunnel that cuts across the ocean. Different countries would need to set aside their individual interests in favor for a common goal, which in itself would be a Herculean task. The political hurdles, funding, maintenance, and profit sharing could spark years, if not decades, of negotiations before a single concrete plan takes shape. Moreover, such a project would raise serious national security concerns. A transatlantic tunnel could serve as a vital link for trade and travel, but it could also become a gateway for smuggling, espionage, and other security threats. Nations would face the challenge of regulating and monitoring the tunnel, likely clashing over control, jurisdiction, and safety protocols. With each country having a vested interest in its operation and security, cooperation would be essential, yet incredibly difficult to achieve. Estimates suggest the cost of such a project could reach almost $20 trillion, which brings us to the financial implications. Even if the political obstacles could be overcome, securing funding for a transatlantic tunnel would require a global effort, with contributions from governments, private investors, and international organizations. But with such a colossal price tag, questions around the economic viability of the project would undoubtedly arise. One of the biggest concerns is the return on investment. While a transatlantic tunnel could, in theory, transport both goods and passengers, the reality is that demand wouldn't justify the cost for decades, if not centuries. The Channel Tunnel, which cost around $21 billion in today's money, faced years of financial struggles and took decades to turn a profit. A project of this scale would likely face even greater economic challenges. A transatlantic tunnel would likely face similar delays in terms of profitability. The ROI might not materialize until well into the future, which means countries and investors would need to make long-term financial commitments, something that's hard to achieve in today's rapidly changing economy. And in a world where technology is advancing at a breakneck pace, there are legitimate concerns about how long such an infrastructure investment would remain relevant. High-speed air travel and even potential advancements in space travel could make a transatlantic tunnel seem outdated before it even gets off the ground. The question arises, would it be worth pouring trillions of dollars into a project that could be rendered obsolete by future technological innovations? The economic gamble would be huge. Beyond the political and financial challenges, the social and cultural impact of a transatlantic tunnel would also be significant. If such a tunnel were ever constructed, it could fundamentally change the way people connect. not just physically, but culturally and economically. Imagine instant travel between continents, commuting from New York to London in just a few hours. While thrilling, such a breakthrough could drastically reshape international relations, migration patterns, and even our daily lives. Such a tunnel could change the global workforce. It would make it easier for people to travel across continents for work, education, and tourism. Companies would be able to hire talent from anywhere, making the workforce truly global. However, this might also result in job displacement as the cost of international travel drops significantly. Smaller industries that rely on regional borders might find themselves competing in a much broader, more intense global market. On the flip side, such a breakthrough could redefine how we perceive cities and nations. If crossing the Atlantic becomes as effortless as a train ride, the geographical boundaries that have shaped cultural and political identities for centuries might start to fade. Cities like New York and London might become even more interconnected, leading to greater economic and cultural integration. But it also raises the question, would this result in the loss of individual national identities or lead to a more homogenized global culture? Additionally, the environmental impacts of such a project could be substantial. While the tunnel might initially seem like a cleaner alternative to air travel, the carbon footprint of constructing and maintaining a transatlantic tunnel would be enormous. Mining and tunneling on such a massive scale would release significant amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Could the environmental cost of the project outweigh the potential benefits? While we're on the topic of the environment, it's essential to consider the ecological effects of a transatlantic tunnel. While the idea of reducing carbon emissions from air travel is an appealing one, building a tunnel under the Atlantic Ocean would come with its own set of environmental risks. The construction would likely disturb marine ecosystems in unprecedented ways. The process of digging through the seabed could disrupt fish populations, undersea plants, and even fragile coral reefs. Not only that, but the operation of the tunnel would require a significant amount of energy. Trains, ventilation systems, and other infrastructure would need power, and the tunnel itself would have to be constantly monitored and maintained. While it's possible that renewable energy could be used to power the tunnel, it's unlikely that a project of this scale could be entirely green. The long-term ecological impacts are hard to predict, but they could be considerable. Assuming an unlimited budget, could we even construct a tunnel like this? The short answer is probably not. The first and most daunting challenge is the sheer depth of the Atlantic Ocean. With an average depth of around 12,000 feet, constructing a tunnel there would be like building at the height of Mount Everest, only deep underwater. Even more staggering, certain parts of the ocean, like the Puerto Rico Trench, can reach depths of 28,000 feet. These kinds of depths are far beyond the reaches of current tunnel construction technology. But why is depth such a critical issue? It's not just about digging a hole, it's about the immense pressure at those depths. As you descend into the ocean, the weight of the water above creates crushing pressures. For context, at 12,000 feet, the pressure is around 5,400 pounds per square inch. That's roughly 350 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. To put it simply, anything we currently use for construction, such as steel and concrete, would be crushed or destroyed by such intense forces. We would need materials that could withstand these enormous pressures, yet no material on the market today can handle these conditions over the long term. So, what materials would be required to build a tunnel at such depths? The unfortunate answer is that we simply don't know yet. There would need to be significant breakthroughs in material science to develop materials that can handle the crushing pressure and harsh underwater conditions. Traditional materials like steel and concrete would fail under this pressure. While newer alloys might be stronger, they still haven't been tested in such extreme conditions. Building such a tunnel would require us to rethink not only construction techniques, but the very materials we use to create these structures. One potential solution could involve developing new composites that could better endure such intense pressures. Some scientists have proposed materials like carbon nanotubes, which are incredibly strong and lightweight. However, even these have limitations, especially when faced with underwater corrosion and the constant motion of the ocean. If dealing with the crushing depths wasn't enough, the ocean floor itself presents its own set of challenges. While the English Channel Tunnel had a relatively flat seafloor to work with, the Atlantic Ocean is a completely different beast. Its floor is not smooth and flat, but jagged and uneven, with massive underwater mountain ranges and deep trenches. The topography is more akin to trying to dig through the Rocky Mountains than a flat landscape. The ocean floor is also not made of a uniform material. While parts of it are solid rock, others are soft, unstable sediments that are prone to shifting. Traditional tunneling methods, like those used in land-based tunnel construction, may not work here. Drilling or boring through these materials could be incredibly difficult and unpredictable. We would likely need to invent new tunneling technologies that have never been tested before. Technology that would need to withstand not just the geological conditions, but the dynamic, ever-changing nature of the ocean floor. Additionally, the Atlantic is a region of intense tectonic activity. The ocean sits at the convergence of several tectonic plates, and earthquakes are a real threat. In some places, the plates shift rapidly, causing massive underwater movements. This could make any tunnel we build prone to damage from earthquakes, shifting sediments, and even underwater landslides, not to mention massive underwater volcanoes as well. Keeping a tunnel intact in such a volatile environment would require cutting-edge technologies yet to be developed that could handle these dynamic forces. Let's now dive into the danger posed by seismic activity and ocean currents. The Atlantic Ocean lies along the boundary of several tectonic plates, and as a result, seismic activity in the region is pretty common. Areas like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge are home to active fault lines that regularly shift. Earthquakes could shake the tunnel's structure, causing fractures, shifting it out of alignment, or even destroying entire sections. Even if we could build a tunnel resilient enough to withstand the tremors of a moderate earthquake, there's another massive problem: ocean currents. Ocean currents are incredibly powerful and can change direction or strength unexpectedly. These shifting currents could erode the tunnel structure over time. Corrosion from saltwater and erosion caused by these currents could cause the tunnel to slowly degrade. Maintaining the tunnel to ensure its structural integrity would be an ongoing challenge, and a major catastrophe could be waiting in the wings if natural forces ever act on the tunnel. The more extreme the conditions, the more vulnerable the tunnel becomes. A small failure in one section could lead to a cascade of damage that may be impossible to repair. Sending maintenance crews thousands of feet below the surface would be incredibly difficult and risky. Any failure could trap them miles under the ocean, making rescue efforts next to impossible. Then there's the logistical nightmare of maintaining a transatlantic tunnel. The Channel Tunnel is already a difficult tunnel to maintain, despite being located in relatively shallow waters. Any underwater tunnel requires regular inspections to check for cracks, corrosion, or any signs of weakness. Today, this maintenance is carried out by specialized teams using remotely operated vehicles or divers. But imagine doing this at depths of over 10,000 feet. The cost, complexity, and risks involved would be astronomical. To maintain a tunnel in such a harsh environment, we would need to deploy deep-sea robots, equipped with the latest technology and capable of navigating the tunnel and performing repairs. These robots would have to withstand the immense pressure, operate in low-light conditions, and communicate effectively with surface crews. The risk of malfunction would be high, and the consequences would be disastrous. If a crack appeared in the tunnel, it could take months or even years to make the necessary repairs. Flooding could become a serious concern, especially given the vastness of the ocean and the difficulty of detecting leaks or small structural failures. A malfunctioning section of the tunnel could cause a flood of water that would be almost impossible to fix in time. Even if we could overcome the geological, natural, and logistical challenges, there's one more hurdle: the cost. Developing the necessary technology and materials for such a project would cost billions, if not trillions, of dollars. Tunnel boring machines are designed for relatively shallow constructions, and they would need to be completely re-engineered to handle the extreme depths of the Atlantic. the cost of developing new materials, robotics, and other technologies would dwarf the cost of building the tunnel itself. And once the tunnel was built, maintaining it would require ongoing investments in technology and personnel. Given the challenges, it's clear that no matter how much money you throw at the project, the cost and complexity would far outweigh the potential benefits. Even if the tunnel was constructed, we would still have to ask the question, would it even be sustainable? Air travel continues to improve, and faster trains are already in the works that could one day make transatlantic tunnels obsolete. The staggering costs of building and maintaining such a structure would likely never be recovered, and there's no guarantee that demand would ever justify its construction. From an environmental perspective, the ecological impact of such a massive construction project would be immense. Extracting materials from the ocean floor and the immense energy required to maintain the tunnel could have severe environmental consequences. With such overwhelming costs, risks, and challenges, it's clear why a transatlantic tunnel may forever remain just a dream. Yet despite these overwhelming challenges, some bold thinkers have come up with creative ideas for making a transatlantic tunnel possible. Here are a few of the wildest proposals. One suggestion is a floating tunnel. This isn't your average bridge or tunnel, but rather an idea where the tunnel would float on the ocean, supported by giant pontoons or anchored to the seabed. In theory, it would avoid the pressure and geological challenges faced by traditional tunnels at extreme depths. Also, you don't have to worry about digging through the earth or rock at the bottom of the ocean. The idea of a floating structure being held in place over a massive stretch of water without it being dragged by currents seems unrealistic. Even with advanced technology, the tunnel would be subjected to forces from wind, waves, and storms, making it a sitting duck for natural disasters. Then there's the issue of corrosion. Salt water doesn't just sit there looking pretty. It eats away at metal. No matter how durable the pontoons are, over time they would erode, weakening the entire structure. Not to mention the wear and tear from constantly moving with the waves. The floating tunnel would need to be constantly repaired, and that doesn't sound like a sustainable solution for the long term. Next up is the more familiar idea of a traditional seafloor tunnel. In this proposal, engineers would tunnel deep into the ocean bed, carving through rock and sediment to create a stable pathway for cars, trains, and other forms of transportation. Sounds simple enough on paper, but the challenges are insane. A tunnel boring machine would face the most extreme conditions, and we're talking about a project that could stretch thousands of miles under some of the most challenging underwater terrains. TBMs are good at digging through softer material, but solid rock at the bottom of the ocean? That's a whole different story. The deeper the tunnel goes, the more specialized and expensive the equipment required. This would make the project not only astronomically expensive, but also incredibly slow and inefficient. Then there would be the maintenance costs of keeping the tunnel operational. Now let's shift over to something a little more futuristic. The Hyperloop, a vacuum-sealed tube extending all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. High-speed pods would travel at speeds up to 700 miles an hour, allowing you to go from New York to London in just about an hour. It's the stuff of science fiction, but for a time, it was also considered a real possibility. While the Hyperloop has seen some success on land in small-scale trials, the idea of scaling it up to span the Atlantic is simply mind-boggling. First off, maintaining a vacuum-sealed tube for thousands of miles across open ocean is not only technologically challenging, it's downright impossible with current engineering methods. For the Hyperloop to function, the tube needs to stay sealed. One tiny breach and the whole system could collapse. There's also the whole issue of pressure. Building a vacuum-sealed tube at that depth would cause it to collapse, not to mention the forces of constant shifting water currents. If the tube were placed too shallow, it would be exposed to ocean storms and hurricanes that could rip it apart. Also, the maintenance required to keep such a delicate system in perfect working condition, tracking down leaks, repairing any damage, and ensuring that the system stays airtight over thousands of miles, would be virtually impossible. Even though the idea of crossing the Atlantic at lightning speed sounds incredible, the cost of building such a system would be out of this world. Add to that the maintenance costs, and it becomes clear that the Hyperloop across the ocean is more of a pipe dream than a feasible future. So why won't any of these ideas work? Well, it all boils down to a few key reasons: scale, environment, and cost. First, the scale of these projects is enormous. A transatlantic tunnel, Hyperloop, or floating tunnel would stretch across thousands of miles of open ocean, presenting logistical and engineering challenges on a scale that we've never seen before. Creating and maintaining a structure of this size requires cutting-edge technology, vast resources, and an insane amount of manpower. And that's just for the construction. After it's built, maintaining it would require near-constant oversight and repairs. Second, the environment presents a host of problems. The ocean is constantly shifting. Currents, storms, earthquakes, and even minor changes in temperature can all affect the stability of a structure in the water. Saltwater corrosion is a constant threat, and even the toughest materials will wear down over time. A tunnel, Hyperloop, or floating structure would be at constant risk from these forces, and no matter how advanced the technology, it would be difficult to keep things running smoothly. Even with unlimited resources, the sheer financial burden of these projects would be unimaginable. The technology required is currently non-existent, and the ongoing costs for maintenance and repairs would drain any budget in no time. Simply put, these ideas are too expensive, too complicated, and just too risky to be feasible. In the distant future, it's possible that advancements in technology could make a transatlantic tunnel a reality. Innovations in AI-driven construction and ultra-strong materials could allow for the creation of structures that withstand the extreme conditions of the ocean. AI might be able to manage the complex task of digging through the ocean floor, while new materials could handle the pressure and forces deep underwater. But we're not there yet. Today, the ocean floor remains an incredibly challenging and dangerous environment for any construction. Even the most advanced materials and machines would struggle to cope with the immense depth and complexity of such a project. So, for now, the fastest and most reliable way to cross the Atlantic is still by plane. Even with rapid advancements in technology, a transatlantic tunnel is more science fiction than reality. It would require billions of dollars and decades of development, if not centuries. Until teleportation becomes a thing, a transatlantic tunnel will likely remain a distant dream. Airplanes will continue to be our best bet for crossing the Atlantic quickly, with the promise of a tunnel only being a possibility in the far, far future. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. Really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack. Passengers scream as a massive inferno tears through the ferry, consuming everything in its path. The heat is unbearable, the smoke suffocating. Desperation takes hold as chaos erupts. They frantically searched for loved ones, calling out names in the hopes of a response. Meanwhile, the crew is nowhere to be found. People fight their way through smoke and thousands of bodies rush to the deck, only to discover the water underneath them is also on fire. To make matters worse, sharks are swimming in the distance. As passengers realize the hopelessness of their situation, they cling to one last desperate choice. They close their eyes, inhale one final breath, and prepare to jump. This horror movie setup is the tragic real-life story of the Doña Paz, the shipwreck you've never heard of that was deadlier than the Titanic. Today, we'll dive into one of the maritime industry's deadliest accidents to explain what happened, what went wrong, and why so many people died. As an archipelago nation with over 7,100 islands, 2,000 of them inhabited, the Philippines depends heavily on a vast ferry network to connect its people. These ferries are more than just transportation. They are lifelines that link communities scattered across the sea. While domestic airlines and robust ferries handle traffic between major cities and ports, smaller towns and islands rely on a secondary network of ferries. Around 150 large ferries operate in Philippine waters, owned by 30 different domestic ferry companies. There are 6 different types of ferries. Some of the most popular include roll-on, roll-off ferries, also known as ro-ros, that transport cargo and passengers and include ramps so both can get on and off the ship faster. Fast crafts that use powerful engines to get to their destinations speedily, and passenger ferries that transport locals and tourists between the islands. However, many of the ferries, especially the passenger ferries, have serious issues. The Philippines is no stranger to shipping accidents. Hernani Fabia, the administrator of the Maritime Industry Authority, also better known as Marina, announced that between 2018 and 2022, around 780 accidents had been recorded at sea. These accidents are usually caused by a result of bad geographic luck, corruption, and lax safety regulations. The Philippines, located off the coast of Southeast Asia, hits squarely in prime typhoon territory. Terrifying storms slam into the islands frequently, with 8 or 9 typhoons crossing the area every year. In fact, the Philippines ranks second globally, only behind the Dominican Republic, in the number of people exposed to tropical cyclones annually. These storms make sea travel risky enough on its own, but it's just the beginning of the problems plaguing Philippine ferries. Overloading, overcrowding, and poor maintenance also play big roles in the accident rate of ferries in the country. Even politicians have noticed. After several headline-making accidents, Paulo Benigno Aquino said, "I reiterate my call to investigate whether our maritime vessels are seaworthy." When investigators took a closer look at these vessels, the findings were alarming. Many Philippine ferries are not as seaworthy as they should be. A significant number of these ferries are second-hand purchases from Japan, often decades old, which makes them less seaworthy than vessels with modern safety measures and almost impossible to maintain. There are no spare parts left for many of the ferries, as the manufacturers have stopped designing them years, if not decades ago. That means that maintenance workers often sloppily patch up problems on board, or have to make new parts by themselves. However, due to low wages in the Philippines and the generally lower income workers who have to take these ferries, operators charge passengers relatively low fares. That means they struggle to make sturdy, well-functioning new parts with their profits. The Doña Paz was one of those second-hand Japanese-made ships, a passenger ferry built in 1963 and operated by Sulpicio Lines at the time of the accident. The ship had originally been bought by Sulpicio in 1975 and sailed under the name Don Sulpicio. But after a fire in June of 1979, it was renamed Doña Paz, a solution sure to fix any structural issues the fire may have caused. The Doña Paz was a tragic example of systemic issues that plague many ferries in the Philippines. Operators often sold far more tickets than there were spaces on board, leading to dangerous levels of overcrowding that pushed vessels well past their intended capacity. Worse still, the authorities tasked with oversight were either absent or corrupt, failing to enforce even the most basic safety standards. The result was an abysmal safety culture aboard these ferries, one so shockingly inadequate it's almost unimaginable, which we'll explain soon. Unfortunately, no global governing body could step in to enforce safety protocol either. Though many countries do look to their guidelines as a safety blueprint, international safety organizations like the International Maritime Organization cannot regulate domestic ferry operations. Ferries in the Philippines oversold tickets throughout the year, but especially during high travel times like holidays and the Christmas season, exactly when the Doña Paz set sail. The ship, which sailed twice a week between Manila, Tacloban, and Cabalagan, was meant to carry around 1,500 passengers and 66 crew. This was already an increased load from the ship's original capacity of just over 600 when it operated in Japan. However, when the Doña Paz was preparing to sail, it was carrying about just under 4,400 passengers, almost 3 times its official limit. The ship had only declared either around 1,500 or 1,600 of those passengers on its manifest. Accounts differ, as the Coast Guard could not allow it to travel otherwise. Passengers who booked last-minute tickets at the port were often left off the official manifest, a deliberate move to skirt safety regulations. And if you're wondering why the Coast Guard didn't notice the thousands of extra people packed into the ferry, well, there's a good chance they never saw any of those people to begin with. We'll get into why the Coast Guard's job is made all but impossible later, but for now, it's important to mention that the Coast Guard in the Philippines has signed many manifests without actually inspecting the ships they're signing off on. It was a practice brought to light in the case of another shipping incident, the sinking of the MB Aya Express at Binangonan. Back at the port, crowds swelled with passengers eager to reunite with their families for the upcoming Christmas celebrations. The Doña Paz was set to follow a route from Tacloban on the island of Leyte to the capital city of Manila. Meanwhile, on another ship, an oil tanker known as the MT Vector was getting ready to travel from Bataan to Masbate. It had 13 crew members on board, as well as over 8,800 gallons of gasoline, kerosene, and oil for Caltex. But the Vector was in no condition to make trips, and certainly in no condition to carry flammable, dangerous cargo. It was, as a Board of Inquiry later put it, a hazard to navigation. Not the thing you want to hear before boarding a form of transportation. To start with, the tanker had a steering defect, and often required 2 crew members to keep the boat on course. That could have been caught during an official inspection, but the tanker also had no certificate of inspection. The captain and the crew of the MV Vector also made the bold choice to sail with no radio operator, since they had already let their radio license expire 18 months prior. To make matters worse, the crew made a reckless and unfathomable decision. There was no lookout on board. The MV Vector was essentially sailing blind, relying on the captain to personally spot any threats from the bridge. But calling him a captain is being generous. The ship's master didn't even hold the chief mate's license legally required to navigate a vessel of this size. Almost no one on board was qualified to do their jobs. The ship itself had major structural issues, and most of the licenses and certificates needed to prove the Vector's seaworthiness were expired or missing entirely. With absolutely nothing prepared or in place, the Vector got ready to leave port. Meanwhile, passengers on the Doña Paz were packed into the ship like sardines. 3 to 4 people were sleeping on each bunk, and in the common areas, there was no room to move. A few people even claimed that the ship was already listing to one side in the port of Tacloban, and for reasons no one can understand to this day, the ship's life jackets were locked away and its radio also wasn't working. And yet, on December 20th, 1987, at about 6:30 a.m. on a Sunday morning, the Doña Paz set sail on what would become its final voyage. Later that same night, the ship was just 110 miles, or 6 hours away from its final destination. It was a quiet night, and the Doña Paz had just entered the Tablas Strait, a channel of water that winds its way between 4 islands, sailing north. Some reports say its navigational lights were either off or malfunctioning. The MV Vector, which had left hours before the Doña Paz, was sailing south in the same strait. There was one problem. Its navigational light was also off, and its defective rudder hadn't gotten any better. Navigating the ship was proving to be a real challenge. At around 10:30 p.m., many of the passengers on the Doña Paz were drifting off to sleep, trying to get a few hours of rest before their arrival at Manila in the early hours of the morning. Suddenly, a deafening bang echoed throughout the ferry, followed by the gut-wrenching sound of metal grinding against metal. Passengers froze as the ear-splitting noise reverberated through the ship. Then, a blinding, bright explosion lit up the night sky. The engine spluttered and died, leaving the 2,215-ton Doña Paz stranded in the middle of the strait. Darkness engulfed the vessel as the ship's lights flickered out. Passengers, gripped by fear, looked around in shock only to see the unthinkable. Fire all around them in every direction. One man, Paquito Osabel, said, "I saw the sea in flames. I shouted to my companions to get ready." People called out names of their loved ones, trying to find them while barely able to see through both the smoke and the packed rooms of the Doña Paz. No alarm had gone off, and the few crew members hanging around were all running around in a state of panic. The passengers were left to fend for themselves. That's because the captain and chief mates of the ships were either resting or partying that night, according to different accounts. The ship's officers were watching TV and drinking beers in the ship's recreation room. The captain had been locked in his cabin, watching a movie. According to one account, the only person on the bridge was an apprentice who had absolutely no clue what to do when a fireball suddenly engulfed the Doña Paz. Safety regulations emphasized that an officer should always be on the bridge to monitor a ship's navigation, especially in waterways like the Tablas Strait, a busy thoroughfare for ships. On deck and in the ship's halls, people could barely move or breathe as the pressure of over 4,000 bodies trying to get out crushed everyone. Those in bunk beds rushed to the nearby cabinets that contained the ship's life vests, only to find them locked. They hopelessly rattled the cabinet doors, hoping to break through, but never did. Passengers on deck tried to get to the railing to jump into the ocean, but an oil leak ignited the water's surface. Even getting to the railings was a problem, as the huge mass of people tried to flee the Doña Paz, which quickly became a death trap. People like Zosimo de la Rama were shoved and trampled on by other passengers and ended up crawling to the railing under a literal stampede. Those who managed to get to the edge took the risk of jumping into fire-covered deep water over staying on a floating inferno. Osabel recalled, "The fire spread rapidly and engulfed our ship. The smoke was terrible. We couldn't see each other, and it was dark." He frantically tried to find his companions. Osabel was traveling with his sister and 3 nieces, but the women were nowhere to be found in the screaming, smoke-filled crowd of passengers. In the end, he lost all hope and realized it was no use. He had to do what he could to save his own life. Taking a look at the flames on the water below, he closed his eyes and jumped in. He somehow survived the initial impact and tried to swim to safety. Those who managed to get away from the ship were horrified. They had to swim past their fellow passengers, either screaming and on fire or already dead, their bodies covered with horrific burns. One 18-year-old man, Arnel Galang, let his instincts take over and immediately dove out through a porthole in the kitchen when the fire started. Galang made the right call, as a few seconds later, the kitchen exploded. Afterwards, the teenager floated around in the waters around the Doña Paz. After jumping from the ship, I saw the vessel engulfed in fire. It rotated maybe twice, and I saw it slowly sinking. Fisherman Salvador Bascal and his 18-year-old daughter jumped overboard. Bascal immediately landed in fiery water, badly burning both his arms and face. His daughter and he slowly made their way to safety. On their way, they found a 3-year-old boy floating in the water and tried to drag him to safety as well. Unfortunately, Bascal realized the boy was already dead. They left him behind and continued to swim. The fact that the captain of the Doña Paz was nowhere to be found also means no distress signal had been sent out. The ferry was falling apart with both the ship and its passengers engulfed in flames, and no one outside the area even knew it was happening. In the meantime, the situation aboard the MV Vector was just as hopeless. The front of the ship had rammed into the port side of the much larger Doña Paz. The fireball, as a result of the thousands of gasoline the Vector was carrying, enveloped the tanker as well. Fire rocketed upwards while the crew of the Vector ran around trying to understand what had happened. A problem that might have been avoided if there was a lookout on board the ship who could have seen the Doña Paz drifting their way and warned the navigator to change course. The amateur sailors on board, clearly in over their heads, tried to get the radio to work, to no avail. There was no radio operator on board to guide them, and the radio itself didn't appear to work at all. No distress signal went out from the MV Vector either. Their only hope for rescue, ironically, was the fireball that lit up the sky. With few good options, they dived into the water as well. Meanwhile, the passengers of the Doña Paz who made it into the sea, alive and severely burned, now faced another problem. Most of them didn't have life jackets, thanks to the locked cabinets, and the waters here are infested with sharks. With the salt water stinging their already searing burn wounds, the remaining passengers looked beyond the sea, desperately trying to find something to cling onto in order to float and potentially survive, and stay out of reach of sharks as much as possible. The problem was that the explosion burned huge chunks of the ship, so there was little debris, at least debris that wasn't currently on fire, to be found. Some people in the water grab onto floating logs, others find suitcases that have fallen from the ship. They scrambled onto them, hoping to stay alive as long as possible. 30 minutes after the explosion, the Doña Paz was almost completely underwater. The survivors watched on, horrified at what they saw. Little did they know, their ordeal was only just beginning. The disaster of the Doña Paz, unfortunately, does not end with the sinking of the ship. Hundreds more passengers would die in the coming hours. Because even though a fire had ignited the sky, help was not coming. When the initial collision happened, a nearby cargo ship named MV Don Claudio saw the explosion. The crew changed course and the ship quickly made its way towards the site of the accident. Accounts differ on how long it took MV Don Claudio to reach Doña Paz, but most sources say between half an hour and an hour. Shockingly, the crew members of Don Claudio reported seeing no sign of the two ships by the time they arrived, just debris and thousands of people floating in the water. In almost no time at all, the Doña Paz and the Vector had already slipped underwater, two massive ships swallowed up by the sea. Unsure what to do in the midst of so many bodies, some alive and screaming, others silent and still, the Don Claudio officers threw a net out into the water. Some of the still-breathing and less injured survivors managed to climb on, and the crew were able to get them out of the water. As the survivors scrambled onto the cargo ship, the crew could see that they were severely burned and needed medical attention. The survivors were mostly men. They included 2 crew members from the MV Vector and 24 passengers, with 1 teenage girl among them from the Doña Paz. Newspaper articles from that time also list a 14-year-old girl and a 4-year-old boy as survivors, though their stories have seemingly been lost to history. However, the crew of the cargo ship now had a big problem. They couldn't bring everyone in the water on board, as they didn't have the space or resources necessary. A real search and rescue mission had to be undertaken. The crew of the Don Claudio took care of the survivors to the best of their abilities, and the ship forged ahead to Manila North Harbor, calling ahead as they approached to have ambulances meet them at the port. So, where were the actual rescuers? The government agencies and forces that were supposed to help? Well, since both ships did not send out a distress signal, and neither used their potentially dead radios to request help, no one was informed of the tragedy right away. By the time Don Claudio had reached the site of the accident, taken some survivors on board, given them medical attention, and made their way to port, several hours had already passed by. In fact, news of the accident didn't reach the Philippine Rescue Coordinating Council, the PRCC, for 8 hours. And even then, they decided to do nothing. Why? Because they had no contact with either of the ships involved in the accident, and all the information they had received was secondhand. They didn't know the specific coordinates of the disaster, or what exactly had happened in the first place. They also didn't know how many people they were supposed to be rescuing, as the ship's manifest listed just around 1,500 passengers on board. The slow response of the PRCC reflects the lack of funding, lack of resources, and corruption endemic within maritime agencies in the Philippines. It's a problem that is being investigated and fought even today. The Philippine Coast Guard, also known as the PCG, is the agency that usually conducts maritime search and rescue missions. It also oversees maritime security, safety, and environmental protection, among others. So why didn't the PCG immediately show up to rescue the passengers and crew of the MV Doña Paz and the MV Vector when they received information about the accident? In short, because it's criminally underfunded, overextended, and completely unable to properly do its job. The PCG has to patrol 500,000 square miles of water, the territorial waters around the Philippines, and a coastline that stretches double the distance of the US coastline. How much money is the agency given to do all that? The answer is almost nothing. Up until recently, the Coast Guard had a total of 13 boats it could use to patrol the waters of the Philippines. Almost all of the boats were built in World War II, meaning they'd probably be better off in a museum than on the sea. It's hard for the Coast Guard to enforce the seaworthiness of the Philippines ferry fleet if they can't even enforce their own. In addition, the PCG has just 2 search and rescue cutters it can use for ships in distress. All in all, it is woefully underprepared to conduct a well-coordinated search mission for thousands of passengers. For all these reasons, the PRCC did not send the Coast Guard on a real search and rescue mission to look for survivors of the Doña Paz accident for a full 8 hours after they heard about it. For 16 agonizing hours, the passengers of the Doña Paz floated helplessly in the water, surrounded by circling sharks and gripped by unimaginable suffering. Many succumbed slowly and painfully to severe burns, smoke inhalation, exhaustion, or drowning. Without any medical attention or rescue in sight, hope faded with each passing moment. After a search and rescue mission was finally started, the PCG, Philippine Air Force, and U.S. Air Force, which had a base nearby, were deployed to look for the shipwreck and its survivors. They failed to find the site immediately, but eventually came upon the debris and floating bodies in the water. As they flew around the area and circled above the survivors, they all quickly came to the same tragic conclusion. There were no survivors to be found. Everyone visible to rescue teams had already died. The coming weeks were shocking and tragic for both the families of the victims and nearby locals. The PCG asked local boat owners and shipping companies for help in retrieving the bodies of the Doña Paz passengers. Over 500 corpses were found. Many would stay buried underwater, within the walls of the Doña Paz. Others had been so close to the initial explosion and fire, there was probably very little of them left to find. Some bodies washed up on the shores of nearby fishing villages. Since the government response to retrieving these bodies was quite slow, locals were forced to spray them with sanitizer and cover them up to prevent the horrible smell and potential contamination from the dead bodies from reaching them. A few bodies were buried before being identified because they spent too long rotting on the beach, and the locals couldn't keep them exposed and in place anymore. Meanwhile, the survivors being treated in Manila hospitals were painting an awful picture for authorities and journalists, many of whom still assumed the ship had only around 1,500 passengers listed. They were telling anyone who would listen that no, the ship had way more passengers, with 3 to 4 people on each bed, and others laying down in the hallways on their own tiny cots or mattresses they had brought with them. Officials soon realized they weren't looking at over 1,000 dead, but closer to over 4,000 dead. Even as their families clamored for their remains to give them a proper burial and goodbye, many of these passengers would never be retrieved or identified. The tragedy of the Doña Paz would become the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. Who knows how many more people could have been saved if a search and rescue mission had been conducted immediately. There were surely more than 24 people alive right after the ship went down. Many more than those rescued by the passing cargo ship could have survived. For that matter, if regulatory agencies and the Coast Guard had been able to do their jobs, the accident might have never happened in the first place, as between overcrowding, lapsed licenses, lack of certifications, and underqualified crews, neither ship should have ever left port. As you might imagine, people were furious with Sulpicio Lines. Victims' relatives showed up in huge crowds outside the company's headquarters, calling for executives to come out and face justice. Inquiries were launched into the sinking to determine who was at fault. A congressional probe committee concluded that both vessels, along with their completely incompetent crew, were at fault. But they also took care to point out that this was a much bigger problem than just these 2 ships. The complete lack of oversight and regulation enforcement on the part of the Philippine government was another important cause of the Doña Paz disaster. The Marine Board of Inquiry, somewhat puzzlingly, decided that only MV Vector was at fault. This was despite the Doña Paz being over capacity by a factor of 3, locking away life jackets and having the entire already underqualified crew drinking instead of manning the ship. Sulpicio Lines was ultimately ordered to pay up to 30,000 pesos to each victim's family, around $509 at the time. Since the sinking of the Doña Paz, Sulpicio Lines has lost another 4 ships to tragic accidents. The company's safety problem got so bad that the government froze operations for its entire fleet after the 2008 sinking of Princess of the Stars, in which 800 people ended up dead or missing. Unfortunately, shortly after, the government rescinded the freeze order on some of the company's ships. As far as the exact direct cause of the accident and how the Vector could have rammed into a passenger ferry without realizing, we may never know the answer. The 2 survivors of the Vector said they were sleeping at the time of the accident, and so have no idea what actually happened. The sinking of the Doña Paz remains the deadliest ship disaster ever during peacetime, with just under 4,400 people dead, excluding 2 crew members from the Vector and 24 or 26 passengers from the Doña Paz, depending on how reliable the accounts of 2 more surviving children are. Many of the passengers are scarred, physically or emotionally, for life. The death toll for this accident far surpasses the much more famous Titanic tragedy, in which an estimated 1,500 people died. Many have speculated that the Titanic garnered far more attention due to the wealth and high social status of many of its passengers. Add to this the opulence of the vessel itself and the fact that it operated between Western nations. In comparison, the passengers of the Doña Paz were by and large low-income workers of a developing country. And outside of the Philippines, the disaster remains less known and largely forgotten, even though the Doña Paz sank a full 75 years after the Titanic, in much more recent history. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack.
As the team of 5 men and their dog sleds battled through howling winds and blinding snow, each step felt like a battle against the elements. Every second took them deeper into the unknown, where frostbite was a constant threat and death lurked beyond the next icy ridge. But they were getting closer to their goal, the South Pole. A place so remote and unforgiving that it was untouched and undocumented by man. But one question loomed over them. Where exactly was it? And would they be the first to conquer it? This is the true story of the insane race to the South Pole on this episode of MatPack. It was the early 20th century, and the great unconquered frontier was looking rather conquered. The most remote areas of Earth were being visited by expeditions from the world's great empires, and many were being immediately colonized for resources. For those who viewed exploration as its own reward, the search was on for new frontiers, and there was no one more determined than Roald Amundsen. The Norwegian explorer was renowned for exploring polar regions. He was already famous for being the first to successfully traverse the Northwest Passage on the Gjoa on a mission that lasted from 1903 to 1906, and now he was ready for a bigger challenge. There were 2 great regions left to be conquered, the poles in the Arctic Circle and the Antarctic. Norway was tantalizingly close to the Arctic, so Amundsen set his eyes on conquering the North Pole, only to see this dashed not long after his return to Norway. American rivals Cook and Parry had already planted the Stars and Stripes at the pole, but not without controversy. Parry claimed to have reached the pole first, but Cook insisted that he had beaten him by nearly a year, sparking a fierce dispute. Amundsen was undeterred and immediately set his sights on the south. Antarctica was an even more remote goal and would require one of the longest sea voyages any exploration team had ever undertaken. This would likely be a multi-year, perilous mission with a high risk of death. But that had never stopped Amundsen before. When Amundsen explained his plans to his backers, many likely thought he had gone mad. Antarctica was known as the last frontier for a reason. It was a vast landscape of ice where death for the unprepared wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty. Spanning an astonishing 5.4 million square miles, Antarctica ranks among the largest landmasses on Earth, second only to modern Russia in size. And it's almost entirely frozen over, offering no refuge from the freezing cold, virtually no drinkable water, no shelter, and no supplies. There's little little animal life too, except for penguins, seabirds, and aquatic mammals along the coast. But to find the South Pole, Amundsen and his crew would have to head far away from the coast and into a lethal trek that would challenge their endurance. So naturally, another crew decided, why not get in on the fun? Amundsen initially held off on explaining his full plans to his backers and the public, knowing they would think he was on a deadly fool's errand. Even as he fundraised, he was cagey about his destination. He didn't even tell his crew as he prepared. He chose his core crew among the most elite explorers of the age. Helmer Hansen played a crucial role in the Gjoa mission, demonstrating unmatched skill and resilience. Sverre Hassel, a seasoned dog sledder, brought invaluable experience from his time aboard the Fram during Amundsen's attempt to circumnavigate Greenland. Oscar Wisting was a decorated military veteran, while Olaf Bjaaland was a champion skier and highly skilled on the ice. They were joined by 14 shore crew, who would be spared the most intense part of the mission. But they had to hurry, because the world's largest empire at the time was on their trail. Robert Falcon Scott didn't just have possibly the most metal name in human history, the British Royal Navy officer was His Majesty's boldest explorer. He had previously set the furthest mark for exploring Antarctica, but had fallen short of the pole. He was determined to return to his nemesis and conquer that goal. And as 1910 dawned, the 42-year-old was ready to launch his own expedition. His own team trended more towards his military background, with Edgar Evans, Henry Robert Bowers, and Lawrence Oates all being fellow Navy chaps. They were joined by Edward Wilson, an explorer and natural historian who had previously worked with Ernest Shackleton. They were an elite team, ready to conquer the pole. But only one mission could succeed. In fact, the two could have worked together in another world. Explorers often forged alliances to take on difficult climates, and Scott had previously sent Amundsen key instruments that aided in his past expeditions. But Amundsen was treating this expedition with more secrecy than ever. He refused to even take Scott's call when the British explorer was in Norway to test new equipment. And so, the two most ambitious explorers in the world would set out on an epic quest, one that could easily end in death for one or both parties. But not everyone was in on the plan. Amundsen had dramatically revised his plans after the Americans reached the North Pole, and he was heavily dependent on funding from the Crown and the Norwegian government to fund his mission. A South Pole expedition would be a huge risk, so he only wanted some key figures to know of it. The plan was for the mission to leave in August of 1910 aboard his famous Fram ship, and then head to the port of Madeira, its only port of call. It would then head due south to the Ross Sea in Antarctica. Now, he just had to tell the crew. While Amundsen's most critical team members knew the details of the mission, the shore crew on the ship didn't, and many were shocked that they were in for a much longer voyage upon leaving the Portuguese coast. Amund presented it as they were making a detour to the South Pole before the North Pole, and gave each man the choice to continue on or disembark. They all chose to proceed. After all, history was waiting. But there was one more person he had to inform of his plan. After all, all's fair in exploration. Why did Amundsen write a cable to Scott, letting him know they would be on the same path? Maybe it was friendly competition, or maybe he was hoping it would be an opening for cooperation. But at the same time, Scott had already set sail on his own ship, the Terra Nova. In addition to his core crew, he had a crew of 65 shore and ship staff, several of whom had been on past expeditions. He drew heavily on his allies in the Royal Navy, and his mission was looking more modern than Amundsen's at first glance. While Amundsen was relying heavily on the traditional northern transport method of dog sleds, Scott was a big fan of new technology and had planned to use motor sleds as well as ponies that had been used by Shackleton. But with new technology comes new problems. The motor sleds had been tricky to use and prone to breakdowns. The ponies were aging and might not be up to extended treks in the Antarctic freeze. Scott did have dog teams, but he was less than enthusiastic about their use. He did have two advantages on Amundsen's team: a head start, as he had set sail about 2 months before Amundsen, and territory in the southern hemisphere. The British Empire spanned the globe, and Australia was a very good staging point to launch their final mission to the South Pole. But both men shared a problem they didn't want to let on about. It took a lot of money to finance an expedition of this scale. Scott, who had previously been funded by the Royal Geographic Society, relied mostly on a combination of private funding and government grants for this mission. He continued to fundraise as he landed in British colonies along the way. Amundsen, meanwhile, had extensive support from the Norwegian government, but the much longer South Pole mission had been met with skepticism, both from the general public and its deep-pocketed donors. And on a mission like this, all that money could go up in a deep freeze. The first phase of the mission would go smoothly. After all, both men had been on long sea voyages before. The Fram sailed south for 4 months, mostly unaware of the hostile response they had been meeting back home. By New Year's Day 1911, they were seeing icebergs, and 2 weeks later, they had made it to the Bay of Whales in Antarctica. Scott, meanwhile, actually joined the Terra Nova after much of the voyage was complete, joining in South Africa and heading on to Melbourne and New Zealand. They took on new supplies at the end of November of 1910, but would immediately run into trouble, because Mother Nature might have been on Amundsen's side. The Terra Nova was heavily overburdened when it set sail, and a storm would soon hit, causing flooding on board and costing them valuable supplies. The ship lost 2 ponies, a dog, and much of their coal and petrol supplies. They didn't so much arrive in Antarctica as hit it, and were stuck in the southern pack ice for 20 days before being able to continue. This heavily ate into Scott's coal supplies. He was only able to continue as 1911 dawned, essentially letting Amundsen catch them. The race to the South Pole was on. The next challenge was to find a site for base camp in one of the most inhospitable landscapes in the world. The Fram had the easier task, having an orderly arrival in the pole with Amundsen picking a site about 4 kilometers from the ship. But there would be significant challenges to setting up the base that would be known as Framheim, transporting much of the ship's massive contents over the ice. 6 teams of dogs were needed to move the supplies, and the shore crew launched hunting expeditions and collected as many seals as they could to keep the crew fed long term. But they were about to get some unexpected company. It was February 3rd when the Terra Nova arrived in the Bay of Whales, having been blocked by the ice from their original destination. They were searching for a suitable approach when they discovered that they had been beaten by their Norwegian rivals. Still, civility won the day, with the two briefly visiting and sharing breakfast, and naturally taking back whatever intelligence they could get from the rival team. Although Amundsen offered the British team a spot alongside Framheim, it was rejected, and the Terra Nova crew returned to the sea around Antarctica to search for the proper starting point for their mission. It would be the start of 2 vastly different paths for the missions. Scott's crew would ultimately settle on Ross Island, in the bay he would name Cape Evans. The hope was that this area would remain free of ice in the summer, allowing the ship to come and go. A prefabricated accommodation had been constructed on the island, and their supplies were transported primarily by the ponies, who proved to be fantastic pack animals despite their advanced age. They then began the process of setting up a series of depots along the barrier on the edge to make it easier to find supplies and shelter as they began the main exploration. But then they had to wait. Because Antarctica was in the southern hemisphere, the seasons were reversed from what both men knew. The sun would set in April and not rise for the entire cold winter. Attempting to explore during this time would lead to certain death, so both men had planned to hunker down with the crew for the winter during the first season. Amundsen was careful to plan for the men to have something to do to avoid loss of morale, so the shore crew spent much of this month working on the sledges that would be used to make their way through the ice. Other tasks were preparing the rations for the journey and checking and improving the equipment. The men were on a special diet with berries and vitamin-rich bread, along with plenty of native meat, including penguins and seals, to keep them supplied with vitamins during the cold, dark months. And not far away, Scott and his men were following a similar plan. The Cape Evans hut would be home for the Terra Nova crew for several months, and in keeping with Scott's background, the whole affair had a more military vibe to it. The hut was subdivided, so the officers and crew were kept fairly separate, and the crew followed a strict schedule of scientific work and prepped for the race ahead. Scott was also very aware of the need for physical activity, both for the animals and the men. Games of football outside were common, and mental exercise was available in the form of lectures answers from the many experts on the mission. And then, slowly but surely, the sun began to rise. It would be Amundsen who would make the first move in early September as the temperature reached a brisk 68 below zero Fahrenheit, or 56 below zero Celsius. They kicked off with a brisk start, using dog-led teams to move 15 nautical miles, or 27 kilometers, a day. The men wore clothing made from insulated wolf and reindeer skin, and even that wasn't enough to keep from serious pain and trouble sleeping. When the dog's paws became frostbitten after only 4 days of travel, Amundsen realized he had made an error. The team built igloos for shelter, and Amundsen made the hard decision that they should return to Framheim. The return was a perilous affair, with several dogs dying. This led to a falling out between Amundsen and his close ally Hilmar Johansen over the timing of the attempt to the pole. The argument had been brewing since before they set out and escalated, leading to Johansen being removed from the polar party. It was a devastating setback, but would it open the door to Terra Nova's victory? Terra Nova had been facing challenges from terrain from the beginning, and that wouldn't stop now. The party had been split into several groups, planning a much more thorough exploration of the pole. The northern party faced serious troubles as the sea ice stymied their path, while western geological parties undertook 2 expeditions to map the massive area. Wilson had even led a winter expedition to Cape Crozier with Apsley, Cherry Garrard, and Henry Bowers, with the intention of obtaining some penguin eggs in an early state of incubation. This was a brutal mission, and was described by a crew member as the worst journey in the world. Scott, however, was pleased at the experiment, as it provided them with more information about the terrain at its worst, and they successfully returned with 3 eggs. But now, it was time for the main event. Scott would give his plans for the South Pole March on September 13, 1911, a little later than Amundsen. He was well prepared, sending out 16 men with motor sledges, dogs, and ponies heading to the Beardmore Glacier. But most wouldn't continue on to the pole. The goal would be to provide support and replenish depots for the return trip. As for the ponies, they would be shot for food along the way. This was harsh and unforgiving terrain, and Scott was not a sentimental man. But now, a mighty climb lay ahead. Scott kept motivation high, and people rather tense by not revealing who would be in the final polar party for much of the journey. The biggest challenge in their way would be the Beardmore Glacier, and this would start with 12 men, with Scott cutting 4 midway through and sending them back with the dog team. Ultimately, on January 3rd, 1912, they would reach a key point, and Scott would make his final cut, leading to the ultimate polar party of 5. There was just one problem. Scott had initially planned on a 4-man team tackling the pole, requiring recalculating of the key weights and rations. But Amundsen had been busy as well. It was a long, bitter month of calculating losses and making plans for the Norwegian explorer, and he didn't feel ready to leave again until October 11th. Now, with his final team of 5 polar explorers, they set out with 4 sledges and 52 dogs and immediately headed into a maze of frozen fog. They nearly met disaster when a sledge almost fell into a crevasse created by the depot team and took Amundsen with it, but a close call was averted, and so they made quick time, once again hitting their mark of 15 nautical miles or 27 kilometers a day. They marked their route using snow blocks every 3 miles. But they were now in uncharted territory. Scott had one key advantage. He was following Shackleton's route, but Amundsen didn't have access to that intel and had to find his own way through the Transantarctic Mountains. He spent several days exploring the foothills before finding a clear route, but they soon discovered it would be a challenging ascent with plenty of detours in the deep snow. They eventually made it to the glacier, about a month after setting out, with Amundsen giving much of the credit to his hardy dog team. Next up would be the hardest climb of the journey. The crew climbed over 10,000 feet, or just north of 3,000 meters, up the glacier, and now the final stage of the journey awaited. 45 of the dogs had survived to this point, and Amundsen made the choice to proceed with a team of 18, with the rest being killed for food. Those who returned from the mission described it as the hardest part of the mission, as these were loyal dogs who had been a key part of the mission. But survival was paramount here, and the men ate up and shared with the dogs before getting ready for the next stage of the mission. The glacier was the biggest obstacle. Both men had to conquer it, but who would be first? This next stretch would be the most brutal for Amundsen's crew. The smaller party with the remaining dogs loaded up their sledges and prepared for a hard march of close to 60 days. Bad weather delayed their initial departure time, and they had no way of knowing if someone else had beaten them in the desolate wilderness. As they soldiered on, they faced near death at every turn, as the icy surface was filled with sharp crevasses that were often hard to see in the blasting wind and fog. Every step could mean possible death, but they were about to enter the Devil's Ballroom. This was the name that Amundsen gave to an area where the crevasses were hidden by snow and ice. Each step was accompanied by an eerie hollow sound that indicated the area under them could break at any second. They eventually moved on to more solid ground, and they were within range of one of the most significant spots in the Antarctic, Shackleton's Marker. The legendary explorer had called off his own mission before reaching the pole, but had left a marker of 88 degrees and 23 minutes. It was the furthest south anyone had ever traveled. When one of the teams saw that, they knew they were close. At this point, the two teams were on the lookout for any signs of their rival. A black flag in the white wilderness would mean failure, and Amundsen nearly had a heart attack when he saw something dark in the snow. But it turned out to be only dog droppings from their own team. So they soldiered on, knowing they were only days away from making history. And far away from their mark, making their own ascent, another team was getting close. It was January 9th when Scott's crew passed the famous mark of Ernest Shackleton. What seemed impossible was now very possible, and they soldiered on through devastating cold for another week. They were now less than 1 day away from achieving their destiny. And then, finally, they saw Roald Amundsen's black flag waving in the cold Antarctic wind. It had been December 14th, 1911, almost a month earlier when Amundsen's team had found the pole successfully, planted the Norwegian flag, and given it the name King Haakon VII's Plateau. They spent several days fixing the location of the pole for their records, and even left equipment for Scott to help their fellow explorer to get back before returning to Framheim over an extensive journey. The daylight was 24/7 during this period, so snow blindness was a danger, but by January 7th, they were arriving at their depots, and by January 30th, they were sailing back triumphant to Norway. But for Scott, it was a very different story. The loser of the epic race to the South Pole, Robert Falcon Scott, was now left alone with the enormity of the moment. He commented that the pole was an awful place to be when you weren't the first. He still hoped to be the first back to Australia to inform the world, so he planted the flag and his men began their journey home. But the men were quickly starting to run down, with several suffering from severe frostbite as they approached the glacier. Petty Officer Edgar Evans would be the first to die, from a combo of frostbite and injury from a fall near the bottom of the glacier. And things were about to go from bad to worse. They arrived at the barrier 3 days before the scheduled dog teams and found low fuel at the depots. Oates had been overcome by frostbite, his hands and feet essentially useless, and willingly chose to leave the tent and walk to his death to increase the team's chance of survival. As the remaining 3 marched on to a large depot, they were hit with a large blizzard, 11 miles or 17 kilometers from their destination. No one knows exactly what happened next, but Scott left a final diary entry detailing the relentless storm, found in what became their final resting place. One mission had ended in victory, the other in tragedy. It would be more than half a year before a successful mission would make it to the site where the men had perished, and a simple memorial would be erected to them. Oates' body was never found, as he had vanished into unknown wilderness. As news spread of Scott's death, the man was viewed as a tragic hero by the public, and few were willing to question the choices he made that led to this end. But in the late 20th century, books were published raising the idea that Scott may have been an an inflexible authoritarian leader whose organizational skills were never questioned due to his military-style leadership. But for Amundsen, glory awaited. The Fram sailed on to Hobart, Tasmania, the site of the telegram location, and learned that there had been no news from Scott. This was March 7th, 1912, and no one yet knew of Scott's fate. He sent telegrams to his brother, his funders, and to the king, before immediately contacting the Daily Chronicle of London and selling the rights to his story. He was in the middle of a world tour celebrating his achievement when word came in about Scott's tragic passing. While they had been rivals, there was a deep core of respect between the two warriors of the unknown, and Amundsen knew well that there were many times in the journey that he could have met the same fate. It was the ultimate irony. An explorer who spent his life fascinated with the North Pole would now be forever associated with the South Pole. But Amundsen would not be satisfied with his victory. He would soon return to the North, seeking to explore it for himself, and he would be one of the first to ever see both poles. But he would meet his end in 1928 on a rescue mission in the Arctic that went down. And in the end, both of the great explorers would find their ends exactly as they lived, in the wilderness of the great unknown. Thanks for watching. For more searches for the great mysteries of the world, check out True Locations of the 7 Ancient Wonders, or watch this other video of ours instead. Thanks for watching, and as always, take care out there.
The blizzard whips around the camp as the man and his wife huddle together, their breaths misting as the last embers of their fire fight for life. Snow falls heavier, a suffocating blanket burying any hope of escape. A desperate cry pierces the frozen silence. The man closes his eyes. The children are hungry. It's been days since they've eaten. There's nothing left. The last of the oxen are long gone. Even the leather strips they had boiled into a bitter, glue-like broth have all been eaten. The woman's hollow eyes meet her husband's. In that shared gaze, a terrible understanding passes between them. If help doesn't come soon, they'll face a choice no one should ever have to make. The Sierra Nevada was supposed to offer them safe passage, but now it's become a frozen graveyard. But what drew them to this part of America? And if you were in the same situation, how far would you go to survive? Manifest destiny was a belief in the inherent right and obligation of American settlers to expand westward across the North American continent. It was steeped in America's notion of exceptionalism, that it was its destiny to spread democratic ideals to the rest of the world. A brainchild of the third American president, Thomas Jefferson, Manifest Destiny led to the purchase of the territory called Louisiana from the French government for $15 million, effectively doubling the size of the country. America's westward expansion significantly accelerated after the Louisiana Purchase and the annexation of Texas, leading to rapid territorial growth of the country. And it worked. The population of America grew from a measly 5 million to 23 million over a 50-year period from the 1800s to the 1850s, one of the accomplishments of the concept. Naturally, people wanted to move west in search of new lands and the natural resources now up for grabs, and that was made possible in 1841 with the Preemption Act, a policy made by the government to encourage and provide settlers with the right to claim 160 acres of land for as little as $1.25 per acre. The West was liquid gold in terms of the fertile soil and mild weather, and inspired a gold rush of its own, except land was the treasure. And what better place than California for the beginning of a new life? This had been exactly what the Donner Party had been searching for as they set off on their treacherous journey, chasing dreams of prosperity. The party was made up of enthusiastic people, including George Donner, a farmer from Illinois, an easygoing and well-liked man, and James F. Reed, a wealthy businessman who organized the ill-fated convoy. On April 15, 1846, the families of James Reed and George and Jacob Donner departed from Springfield, Illinois, to start a new life in California. About 100 miles from Independence, Missouri, the group of 31 joined a large wagon train. Independence was a logical place to start their expedition, as it marked the beginning of the Oregon, California, and Santa Fe trails. The busy town was a haven for travelers, providing a last opportunity to buy wagons, oxen, food, and stock up on all kinds of supplies. By that time, more families had joined the expedition, families like the Breens, the Murphys, and the Eddies, making the total number 87, including men, women, and children. In May of 1846, the party set off on their journey west. The group traveled by land in 23 wagons, pulled by oxen and mules, carrying supplies for the months-long uphill journey ahead. George Donner traveled light with his 5 children and his wife, Tamsin. On the other hand, James Reed had bigger plans for the journey, and his supplies reflected that. He traveled with his wife, Margaret, his mother-in-law, and their 4 children. His custom-built palace wagon was so-called due to the large storage space it had. Reed took full advantage of this, using it to store supplies, bunks, and a stove. Unfortunately, that made the wagon too heavy to move smoothly, which slowed down the whole group. The party embarked on the daunting California Trail, a path stretching over 2,000 miles. This winding route led them through the vast plains, scorching deserts, and treacherous mountains of Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. At first, the journey seemed full of promise, a passage to a brighter future. But as the days turned into weeks, the harsh realities of the trail revealed themselves. At first, the landscape was gentle, at least until they crossed the flat plains of Kansas and followed the Platte River through Nebraska. The ground was grassy and open, making it easier for wagons to travel over. The river, wide and shallow, was an important source of water for the immigrants and their animals. However, the danger began to surface early on. The wagons frequently broke down due to their heavy loads, and they required constant repairs. Arguments and disputes broke out on whether to rest or move forward, hinting at the haunting hazard waiting ahead. The fear of illness and diseases added to the stress of the journey. By late July of 1846, the group had traveled nearly 650 miles, reaching Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, a major trading post. This is the point where the Reeds, Donners, and several other families made the fatal decision to quit the well-traveled California Trail and take a new, untested route known as the Hastings Cutoff. They were influenced by Lansford Hastings, a trail guide and a lawyer who argued this path would be quicker and easier cutting through Utah and Nevada. Hastings believed that the cutoff would shave 300 miles off their journey, giving them the chance to rejoin the California Trail on the other side of the Sierras. Considering a wagon could travel 12 miles on a good day, they could easily traverse the 300 miles and arrive at their destination more than a month early. Only a few weeks earlier than this, a group of 60 to 75 wagons had taken the same route, and another traveler assured them that it was a good route to follow. James Kleiman, Reed's friend who had been returning from the Hastings Cutoff, advised him against it, but his advice fell on deaf ears. Hastings had his own interests in steering the group that way. He'd been promoting his new route, the Hastings Cutoff, sending riders to deliver letters to traveling migrants, claiming it would save time on their journey. On July 12th, the Reeds and Donners received one too. Hastings claimed to have worked out a new and better road to California and said he would be waiting at Fort Bridger to guide the migrants along the new route. Convinced by his silver tongue, the group elected Donner as captain, forming the Donner Party and separating from the rest of the group on July 20th, while the rest of the party chose to take the old, well-trodden trail. Despite the warnings of the experienced travelers, they chose to leave the established track at the Little Sandy River and take the shortcut, which eventually dropped them into some of the most challenging and demanding landscapes of the American West. The path to destruction was paved with greed and blind ambition. As the Donner Party pressed on toward Black's Fork, their sights set on Hastings Cutoff, journalist Edwin Bryant had already arrived at Black's Fork a week earlier. He was faced with a treacherous stretch of the trail that left no doubt in his mind. The heavily loaded wagons, burdened with supplies and carrying women and children, would struggle, if not fail, to pass through. Bryant, realizing the gravity of the situation, raced back to Black's Fork to pen urgent letters. He warned several members of the group to avoid Hastings' so-called shortcut, a route that promised speed but contained a number of deadly perils. When the group arrived at Black Fork on July 27th, they discovered that Hastings had already departed, leading the 40 wagons of the Harlan Young group ahead. At Jim Bridger's trading post, the group was met with glowing praise for Hastings Cutoff. Bridger, eager to draw more travelers to his post and bolster his business, described the route as a smooth, easy journey, free from rugged terrain and the threat of hostile Native Americans. Bridger assured them that water would be plentiful along the way, even claiming the daunting 30 to 40-mile dry lakebed would be manageable. His reassurances were enticing, but dangerously misleading. Meanwhile, Edwin Bryant's critical warning letters were nowhere to be found. Suspicion later fell on Bridger himself, with Reed testifying that the letters were likely concealed, deliberately silencing a warning that could have changed the Donner Party's fate. Then, on July 31st, 1846, the ill-fated group left Black's Fork after 4 days of rest and wagon repairs, 11 days behind the leading Harlan Young group. The party was also joined by the McCutcheon family, consisting of William, his wife Amanda, their 2-year-old daughter Harriet, and a 16-year-old named John Baptiste Trudeau from New Mexico. Trudeau claimed to know Native Americans and the California terrain like the back of his hand. The first substantial obstacle they faced was the Wasatch Mountains in northern Utah. Hastings had left vague written instructions in his letters stuck on trees to show them the path. These directions led them up steep hills on which the drivers were forced to lock the wheels of their wagons to prevent them from rolling down. Years of traffic on the main Oregon Trail had left an obvious, flattened path, whereas the cutoff was a rocky, uneven mess. A letter found on August 6th advised them to stop until Hastings could show them an alternate route to the one taken by the Harlan Young party. Growing frustrated with his cat-and-mouse games, Reed, Charles T. Stanton, and William Pike rode out ahead to get Hastings. But the scene that faced them was devastating. A labyrinth of treacherous canyons where massive boulders blocked the path and sheer cliffs loomed ominously. To reach the river below, the group faced a harrowing task, carving precarious ledges into the rock, a gamble that seemed destined to shatter their wagons and their hopes. The only ray of hope was in a Hastings letter, in which he had offered to guide the party around the more difficult areas, but he rode back only partway, indicating the general direction to follow. Reed returned to the group alone 4 days later, while Stanton and Pike stopped to rest. With limited choices, the group finally decided to follow Hastings' new path under Reed's reluctant advice. For 2 exhausting weeks, the Donner Party battled through this harsh environment where every mile was a challenge. As feared, the settlers had to dismantle their wagons to navigate over boulders and through narrow passageways. They even cut down trees to create a trail. Their progress slowed to about 1.5 miles a day instead of the 12 miles originally calculated. What would have been a few days' journey over a 36-mile stretch in the Wasatch Mountains turned into a 2-week ordeal. This delay was catastrophic, as it brought them closer to winter and drained their supplies. Few among the group had ever faced such unforgiving terrain, and their inexperience quickly became evident. The arrival of the Graves family, who had set out to catch up with them, brought a brief moment of relief, but also a stark reminder of their situation. Franklin Ward Graves, his wife Elizabeth, their 9 children, and a son-in-law had joined the party, having been part of the last group to leave Missouri. Their presence confirmed a sobering reality. The Donner Party was now unmistakably the tail end of the year's western exodus, with dwindling time and increasingly perilous conditions ahead. They got their first ray of hope on August 20th, when they finally reached a point in the mountains where they caught a glimpse of the Great Salt Lake. Yet, it took almost another 2 weeks to make it out of the Wasatch Range. By that time, the men had started arguing, with the blame being set on Reed's shoulders for the foolish decision to take that particular route. Too little, too late, as the situation had become dire by now for the less affluent families, as their food and supplies began to run out. They breathed a sigh of relief when they finally emerged from the mountains, only to be confronted by another challenge: the Great Salt Lake Desert. At 12 miles long and 5 miles wide, the Bonneville Salt Flats were a stark, shimmering expanse in what is now Utah, mirroring the bleakness of their situation. It was already the end of August when they stumbled upon a tattered letter from Hastings. The scattered pieces informed them of 2 days and nights in relentless travel under the unrelenting sun. In reality, it took them nearly a week to cross the merciless desert. The salt-coated ground concealed deep mud that ensnared wagons and animals. During the day, the sun reflected off the salt flats, producing an unbearable, searing heat. Meanwhile, the nights were Arctic cold, but what was worse was the dryness of the desert, with no water resources in sight. The settlers had to ration what little they had, but several oxen and horses succumbed to thirst. Wagons were stranded as they broke down, and the supplies continued to diminish. The grueling journey eased up as they passed through the valley next to the Ruby Mountains. Though they resented Hastings, they had no choice but to follow his tracks, which were already weeks old. On September 26th, 2 months after embarking on the cutoff, the party finally came across the traditional trail running along a stream that became known as the Humboldt River. By that time, the shortcut had delayed them by around a month, but the journey through Nevada's Humboldt River basin brought even more challenges. The shallow, winding river offered little assistance, and the sandy, brush-covered terrain made it difficult for their exhausted animals to pull the wagons. There was the added complication of the Paiute Native Americans that killed off some oxen and made off with others. By the time the party reached the other side, near what is now Pilot Peak, they were utterly fatigued and demoralized. The Donner Party rejoined the main California trail near present-day Elko, Nevada, but the damage was already done. They were now a month behind schedule. Their supplies were almost depleted, and anxieties within the group were escalating. Arguments became more frequent, with one altercation having tragic consequences. James F. Reed clashed with John Snyder over a trapped wagon. The argument escalated rapidly. Snyder struck Reed with the handle of his whip, and in the chaos that followed, Reed fatally stabbed him. The group held a swift trial and decided to banish Reed. Alone on horseback, he set off for California to seek help, leaving his family behind with the rest of the group that moved on with its journey. Reed's crime, though shocking, was only indicative of the desperation and despair setting in. It had become a game for survival of the fittest, and the group slowly turned against each other, each man for himself. Grass was becoming scarce, and their animals were steadily weakening. In an effort to relieve the animals' load, everyone was expected to walk. One traveler, Keseberg, ejected Hardcoop, a 70-year-old man, from his wagon, telling him that he had to walk or die. He tried his best, but the last time he was seen alive a few days later was as he sat next to a stream, his feet so swollen they had split open. William Eddy pleaded with everyone to look for him, but they all refused, swearing they would waste no more resources on an old man. Humanity had died with Hardcoop's demise. A flicker of hope arrived when Stanton, who had left a month earlier to seek help in California, reappeared with reinforcements. He brought much-needed supplies, mules laden with food from Sutter's Fort, and introduced 2 Native American guides, known by their Catholic names, Louis and Salvador. Alongside the provisions, Stanton carried a vital piece of news. James Reed had successfully reached Sutter's Fort. For a moment, the weary travelers dared to hope, even as the path ahead grew ever more uncertain. They pushed on over mountains that were described as much worse than the Wasatch Range. During this time, they lost one more family man to an accidental rifle shot, while another received a surface wound. They reached the base of the Sierra Nevada, the imposing structure the only obstacle between them and California. It was already late October, and winter had arrived. They followed the Truckee River, expecting to reach the pass that would take them into California's Central Valley. Regardless, snow had already started to fall on the peaks, a warning of the challenges ahead. The party set up camp near Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, situated about 6,000 feet above sea level. They planned to rest briefly before making their final ascent over the mountains. Snow wasn't expected till the middle of November, but this year, it came early. In the first weeks of November, a severe winter storm struck, leaving several feet of snow overnight, and the pass, now referred to as Donner Pass, became impassable. Wagons were covered under heavy snow, and the settlers' oxen either got stuck or froze to death. Struggles to move forward were hopeless, and the settlers soon realized they were trapped. Trapped with no means of escape, the Donner Party prepared to endure the unforgiving winter. Their supplies, already stretched thin from weeks of rationing during the grueling trek through Utah and Nevada, had dwindled to almost nothing. Desperation forced them to build makeshift shelters from wagons and felled logs, but these crude structures offered little protection against the relentless cold. As the snow piled higher and temperatures plunged, starvation began to take hold, its grip tightening with each passing day. The snow persisted to fall relentlessly. Historical records demonstrate that the winter of 1846 to 1847 was among the harshest ever recorded, with snowdrifts soaring to 20 feet. The mighty peaks and thick forests of the Sierra Nevada trapped the group, making the search for food unthinkable. At first, the settlers carefully rationed their dwindling food supplies, hoping to stretch them through the harsh winter. But as the days wore on, desperation set in. They turned to slaughtering the oxen and horses that had accompanied them on their journey, consuming the meat in a grim effort to survive. Yet, even these resources quickly ran out. Scouring the snow-laden forest, they hunted for any sign of life. Mice, squirrels, or really anything edible. Their searches yielded nothing but bitter disappointment. With no other options left, they resorted to boiling the hides of their oxen, reducing the tough leather into a foul, glue-like jelly that barely sustained them. They softened and ate strips of leather from belts, shoes, and even the covers of their wagons. Families scraped bark from the trees to chew on, and some even tried eating pine cones. Despite their efforts, starvation took hold, and with it came inhumanity. People became weak, unable to walk or even sit up, including the children who cried from great hunger, leaving their parents feeling helpless. Survival had become difficult, to the extent that some of the settlers made the difficult decision to move to the other side of the mountains to look for help in California. The 15-person group set out on December 16, 1846, from the camp to cross the mountains. This group, which would be later known as the Forlorn Hope, consisted of William Eddy, one of the strongest men, and Mary Graves, who was only 20 years old at the time. They took the last of their food and fashioned snowshoes from ox hides to navigate the deep snow. The snowshoes offered some relief, but the struggle was far from over. The malnourished members, unaccustomed to enduring 12 feet of snow and frigid conditions, found their strength waning rapidly. By the third day, most had succumbed to snow blindness, their vision blurred by the relentless glare. On the morning of December 21st, the group pressed forward once again, but the punishing journey claimed yet another life. Stanton, who had been valiantly struggling to keep pace with the main group, stopped to rest, only to be left behind. He was never seen alive again. A year later, his remains were discovered at the very spot where exhaustion had overtaken him, a haunting reminder of the cost of survival. As starvation set in, confusion and delirium gripped the group, clouding their judgment and unraveling their resolve. After 2 more agonizing days without food, Patrick Dolan made a grim suggestion. One of them should sacrifice themselves to feed the rest. The grim proposal sparked desperate debate. Ideas ranged from duels to lotteries, each suggestion darker than the last. Others argued they should simply keep moving until someone collapsed from exhaustion. A horrifying yet merciful alternative. But before they could decide, nature forced their hand. A sudden blizzard swept through, claiming the life of Antonio, the animal handler. Soon after, Franklin Graves succumbed to the cold and starvation, the group's fragile unity splintering further with each loss. The group was lost in the freezing outdoors for over a month, facing hunger and frostbite. They had to stop often because some were too weak to walk. Then, when all their food ran out and death seemed certain, they made a horrific decision. They had to eat the bodies of those who had died. As though driven mad by the relentless icy drifts, Dolan began to rant deliriously, stripped off his clothes, and ran into the woods. He returned shortly afterwards and died a few hours later. His death brought life to some of his companions, as some of the group began to eat flesh from Dolan's body. Murphy Lemuel's sister tried to feed him some, but he died shortly afterwards. Eddie, Salvador, and Lewis refused to eat. The next morning, the group stripped the muscles and organs from the bodies of Antonio, Dolan, Graves, and Murphy, their fallen comrades. They dried them to store for the days ahead, taking care to ensure nobody would have to eat his or her relatives. William Eddy later recounted on how they sliced the flesh into thin strips and dried it under the sun. Louis Kiesberg, a German immigrant, later confessed to consuming human flesh, a revelation that cemented his place as one of the most notorious figures in the tragedy. In later accounts, Kiesberg defended himself, saying, "I did what I had to do. It was that or die." 13-year-old Mary Murphy was another survivor who became an orphan after her parents lost their lives in the Sierra Nevada Pass. Mary said she had tried to avoid eating human flesh but eventually gave in. Some of the group refused, even as they grew weaker, but most agreed, knowing it was their only chance to survive. Though their approach could be considered ruthless, it helped them survive. The forlorn hope finally reached a ranch close to the Sacramento Valley on January 17, 1847, from which only 7 of the 15 had made it out alive. The forlorn hope brought news of the Donner Party to settlers in California. Shocked and horrified, they organized a rescue party immediately. This group, led by James Reed, who had been banished earlier, left California in February of 1847. The first rescue team reached the camps on February 18, 1847. They were greeted with the shocking sight of pale, weak, and barely alive settlers. Some had frozen to death, while others were suffering from starvation. The rescuers called the shelters filthy, and the camp was surrounded by the stench of death. The settlers told the rescuers that they had eaten every animal, including their dogs, and boiled their leather goods to eat. Some of the survivors confessed to cannibalism, while others, including George Donner's wife, Tamsin, reportedly said she could not bear to eat human flesh, even though she was dying. The first rescue party to reach the stranded travelers brought a glimmer of hope, but it was fleeting. Their supplies were scarce, and the treacherous snow made the journey back nearly impossible. In the end, they could only take 23 survivors, most of them children, leaving behind food and a solemn promise to return. Over the next 2 months, 3 more rescue teams braved the mountains. Each expedition was met with relentless storms and snow so deep it slowed their progress to a crawl. When the second group finally arrived in early March, they were greeted by even more death. One of the survivors, Patrick Breen, made a journal of every one of his experiences, including the ruthless cold, the constant hunger, and the loss he suffered of his companions. As time passed, other people in the group became hopeless. They grew desperate and frustrated. Disease had ravaged the settlers, leaving many too weak to move, including their group captain, George Donner. A festering wound on his hand had turned gangrenous, confining him to his makeshift shelter. His wife, Tamsin, refused to abandon him, even as rescuers pleaded for her to save herself. By mid-April, when the last rescue team arrived, they discovered that only a few individuals were still alive. Tamsin Donner, unfortunately, had passed away, but an earlier group had rescued her children. By April of 1847, the tortuous saga of the Donner Party had ended. For months, 4 separate rescue teams braved the snow-covered mountains to rescue the survivors. In the end, only 48 of the 87 people who went on the trip survived. The survivors were transported to settlements in California, especially to Sutter's Fort, which was a major way station for travelers near what is now Sacramento. They were fed and attended to, but healing took time. Many survivors were severely malnourished, weak, and emotionally destroyed. Others were in dire physical condition, frostbitten or injured, and many carried the traumatic psychological scars. Most of them were children, as rescuers prioritized evacuating them when determining who to rescue. As news poured in about the party's nightmare, it shocked the entire nation. Survivors such as William Eddy, whose wife and children died, had absolutely no one in the world. Eddy would later say that the emotional pain of losing his family was worse than the physical pain he felt on the journey. He went on to become a vocal advocate for remembering the lessons of the Donner Party. He spent much of his life telling their story and warning others about the dangers of unprepared travel in the West. The Reed family, however, was among the luckier ones. James Reed, who had been banished earlier in the journey, had worked tirelessly to organize the rescue efforts. His wife, Margaret Reed, and their children all survived, making them one of the few families to stay intact. Most of the men in the group perished, as they often gave their food to the children or women or exerted themselves more by hunting and building shelters. Women had a higher survival rate, partly because of their greater body fat percentage that helped sustain them during starvation, in addition to the reason mentioned just before. The Donner family in particular had faced immense suffering, with George and his wife Tamsin both dying. However, their children survived and were rescued in earlier missions. Most of the survivors, after being the victim of their ill fortune, attempted to rebuild their lives in California. Some of them successfully built a new life out of their experiences, while others struggled with the trauma and stigma of their experiences. The Breen family relocated to San Juan Bautista, California. They remained deeply religious and lived quietly, rarely discussing their time in the mountains. Patrick's journal, which he had maintained during the winter, became one of the most significant records of the Donner Party's experience. The Reed family started a new life in San Jose, California. James and his own flourished. The Reeds managed to avoid much of the scandals surrounding cannibalism, as they were among the few who did not eat human flesh during the ordeal. Mary Graves lost her parents and several siblings in the tragedy. Despite her trauma, she married and had children. She worked hard to create a stable life, but carried the emotional scars for the rest of her life. She was later quoted saying, "I would give everything I have to forget that winter." Louis Keseberg emerged as one of the most controversial survivors of the Donner Party. While he openly confessed to cannibalism, he faced far graver accusations, claims that he had murdered Tamsin Donner to consume her flesh. Though Keseberg vehemently denied these allegations, the damage was done. Shunned by society, Keseberg struggled to rebuild his life under the weight of public scorn and whispers that never truly faded. As the Donner Party's tale came to light, it created havoc in the United States. The details of the horrific accounts of starvation, death, and cannibalism filled newspapers and magazines. The fact that the settler families had resorted to eating human flesh frightened people throughout America. The survivors received mixed responses. Some were shown sympathy for their suffering, while others faced suspicion or even revulsion, particularly those who had admitted to cannibalism. The Donner Party's story also served as the moral tale about the dangers and perils of westward migration. Lansford Hastings was held responsible for promoting the inaccurate Hastings cutoffs. His reputation also suffered, yet he persisted in promoting other ventures. Eventually, the Donner Party incident became a part of American history and folklore. Truckee Lake, later renamed Donner Lake, bears a large monument to the members of the party and their struggle and fight for survival. Historians and researchers have continued to investigate the Donner Party over the years, trying to understand the series of mistakes that sealed their tragic fate. A major lesson of their story is again the essential need for planning. The party had brought supplies that were insufficient, and they made bad choices, such as choosing the Hastings cutoff. Many survivors displayed incredible strength and a desire to live, even in the face of terrible conditions. While a real tragedy, it is also a tale of the resilience of the human spirit. Survivors like Mary Graves, William Eddy, and Margaret Reed rebuilt themselves and their lives after returning to their homes and after a traumatic, tragic loss. They survived what might be among the harshest conditions imaginable, the worst temperatures, starvation, isolation, and whatnot. But against all odds, almost half of them lived. Their story today stands as a memorable reminder of the sacrifices and fights endured by those pursuing a new life in the American West. Their names live on, not only as victims of a tragedy, but as abiding reminders of the resilience and resolve that helped shape a nation. The story of the Donner Party is one of survival, sacrifice, and moral dilemmas. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack.